The year is 1990. Florida retiree Jack Gargan is mad as hell and he is not gonna take it anymore. So he pulls nearly $50,000 out of his retirement fund and buys a run of full-page newspaper ads that say, quote, "I'm mad as hell and I am not gonna take it anymore." The thing he's mad about, and the thing he's been mad about for many years, is the role money plays in American politics. In 1974, he ran for Tampa City Council and was appalled by how much money his opponents were spending while campaigning for a somewhat minor office. One spent $8,000, another spent $20,000. Gargan claimed to have spent less than $5 out of principle. Way less, actually. His campaign budget was later revealed to be 40 cents. This meant that instead of paying the $400 filing fee to get his name on the ballot like the others did, he had to do so via petition. And since he couldn't hire anyone to collect the 3,000 necessary signatures, he had to do it himself, spending day after day baking in a suit and tie under the Tampa sun. Gargan finished a distant 5th place in the race, but still attracted more than 1,600 votes after a campaign in which he spent exactly 40 cents. That crunches out to about 4,000 votes per dollar spent. Joe Biden raised $950 million for his 2020 presidential campaign, a number Gargan, who passed away in 2018, would have found revolting. Even after adjusting for inflation, if Biden had run his campaign with Gargan's efficiency, that would have bought him 728 billion votes, meaning every single American of voting age would have voted for him nearly 3,000 times. These obscene levels of spending shut out all but the major players and make politicians more accountable to their financiers than their voters. This, among a litany of other things, is what has Gargan so appalled, bitter, outraged, angry, incensed, livid, even more livid, enraged, disgusted, fed up, shocked, really hacked off. Ooh, that's good, I want to borrow that one. Tired, insulted, and sad. His call to action, as well as the name of his organization, is simply throw the hypocritical rascals out. He's asking you and me to clip, fill out, and mail in this pledge to go to the polls and vote against literally every single incumbent candidate at the municipal, state, and federal level. Doesn't matter who they are, which party they belong to, or which policies they represent. They've all got to go if we're ever going to get big money out of politics, eliminate deficit spending, and give the government back to the people. This is an interpretation of a commonly used political spectrum chart, the idea being that you generalize a given person's political positions and plot them according to how far to the left or right they are, economically as well as socially. It has its limits, and as you'll see, a cast of characters awaits us that's so bizarre as to defy simple categorization, but it's a board we can throw some darts at. Gargan seems to lean a little bit conservative fiscally while remaining agnostic on social issues completely. He is the rarest of things in the American political landscape, a true believer, a man of real conviction and ambition. His concern that this pledge will be shared and photocopied to the point of illegibility tells us his intentions of upending the apple cart are very real. In cribbing Howard Beale's iconic line from the film Network,
"Stick your head out of the window, open it, and stick your head out and keep yelling and yell, I'm as mad as hell, I'm not gonna take this anymore."
He's clearly hoping for the same reaction Beale is receiving here, but what makes this scene so powerful and resonant isn't that we think this is possible, it's that we know it's not. We're a nation of strangers. We're too atomized, alienated, checked out, to collectively throw our windows open and scream Howard Beale's line into the rainy night. This is not happening. Except, in 1990, to a measured degree, it kind of is. More than 100,000 people fill out this pledge and mail it in. He raises north of $1 million. But even in this moment, it's not possible for Jack Gargan to comprehend the enormity of what he has just begun to build. This movement will soon blossom into one of the most shocking, unforeseeable, and outright weird episodes in all of American political history. A story written by millions of Americans who demand reform. Many of us in America enter every election season without being offered a viable political party with a realistic chance of winning major office that sufficiently reflects our ideas and priorities, leaving us to either settle for the party we can live with or check out of the political process altogether. This is the story of the people who decided to establish an alternative, and what came of it when they did. They advocated for a set of political positions that might or might not resemble yours or mine, but they were also after something greater, something thought to be impossible. A total and permanent dismantling of the two-party system. It's 1991, a year in, business is booming at Throw the Hypocritical Rascals Out, typically referred to by its acronym, THRA? An acronym that's this close to spelling out its own first word. It's a shame Gargan couldn't have called it Throw the Hypocritical Rascals Out of Washington or something. In more ways than one, he desperately needs a W. Gargan intends to throw a Hail Mary. He's looking to recruit a candidate he can load up with all his hopes and dreams and make a run at the White House. Gargan's not a young man, and although he wants to throw all the bums out at the city, county, state, and federal levels, he doesn't have the eons of time it would take to personally see it through. Instead, he has his sights set on bum number one, the Death Star. George H.W. Bush is the latest offering from a Bush family of politicians and business magnates. Former director of the CIA, vice president for 8 years, president for 4 years, the very definition of the establishment. Now the incumbent president is seeking a second term and appears so unbeatable that many of the most viable Democratic candidates have decided to sit this election out. But to Gargan, there is no better candidate to run against than Bush, a guy who so perfectly represents the powers he's trying to break apart. And to him, there would be no better challenger to get behind than Henry Ross Perot. Ross Perot is a man so disciplined and straight-laced that he probably never needs a haircut. His hair just knows to stop growing once it reaches crew cut length. But he harbors the very same qualities as the Reform Party he will eventually found. Ostensibly right down the center, straight as an arrow. And despite that, or more likely because of that, incredibly weird. This weirdness is the quality our Z-axis desperately flails toward. Sorely lacking a better term, I'm going to call this the fascination index. It doesn't necessarily confer positive or negative qualities, nor does it necessarily mean one is a good or bad person. It correlates instead with an individual's uniqueness, eccentricity, tendency to fascinate. In other words, do they have the pull? Do they have the juice? This is entirely subjective and unscientific, but I think anyone familiar with Ross Perot would agree he's got it by the truckload. After his years in the Naval Academy, the pride of Texarkana, Texas, got a sales job at IBM where he became perhaps the greatest salesperson in the history of the company, once knocking out his entire annual sales quota by mid-January. Perot eventually outgrew IBM, formed a competitor in EDS, and became the third wealthiest person in America. This was not enough to keep Perot busy. He once helped orchestrate a riot in Tehran as part of a sophisticated plot to free a couple of his employees from an Iranian prison. He affiliated himself with the likes of Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, and Oliver North, who told him to do all kinds of weird stuff with large sums of money, all of which I'm sure was totally above board. Perot did apparently have a line in the sand, though. When North asked him to help fund the Contras, Perot told him to get lost. This is the duality of Ross Perot. He tends to be uncompromisingly, fearlessly, straight up honest about what he believes, regardless of how unpopular it might be. For instance, when he was invited to lead a task force exploring ways to improve public education in Texas, Perot floated the solution of dramatically slashing funding for high school football. Again, in Texas. On the other hand, he periodically trots out a little collection of anecdotes that range from somewhat dubious to obvious lies. Like the one in which he claims that the North Vietnamese hired 5 Black Panthers to assassinate him but were chased away by his dog. Ross Perot is attention-getting, outspoken, independent, rich enough to not have to rely on outside money, and having never actually run for office before, unsullied by the political machine. Perot is, in other words, Jack Gargan's image of the ideal holder of public office, even the top public office. In May of '91, Gargan scores a meeting with Perot and asks him to speak at a Thraw rally in November. Perot says yes. Gargan also asked Perot to consider an independent run for president of the United States. Perot says no. The 2,000 people who packed the room to see Perot urge him to run. He still says no, but he echoes Gargan's call to throw the bums out. In the coming months, Gargan continues to insist, and Perot continues to refuse. By the time Perot goes on Larry King Live in February of '92, he has said no to 1,000 people, but Larry, who's long been enamored with this charismatic little fella, is delighted to be person number 1,001.
Is there any scenario in which you would run for president? Can you give me a scenario in which you'd say, okay, I'm in?
And Perot says what he's always said.
I don't want to.
But then, for the first time, he delivers an answer that isn't a flat no.
If you're that serious, you, the people, are that serious, you register me in 50 states. And if you're not willing to organize and do that, then this is all just talk.
In waiting for his supporters to secure ballot access in all 50 states, he is setting the bar really high here. Probably too high, or so he hopes. You see, Ross Perot is clearly a guy who loves the spotlight. Attention fuels him. Even so, you gotta be at least a little bit of a sad individual to even seriously want to be president of the United States. And to actually mount a presidential campaign, you gotta be a real sicko. And to run as an independent candidate, that's just signing up for inevitable ridicule and disgrace. So far in the 20th century, that's been the story for independent and third-party seekers of the presidential office. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt of the Bull Moose Party drew a larger popular vote than the Republican candidate, but of course, he benefited from actually having been president before. Robert M. La Follette recaptured some of Roosevelt's momentum to make a decent showing in 1924. In 1968, George Wallace picked up 13% with his racist pro-segregation campaign. Since then, GOP defector John Anderson has been the only non-Republican or Democratic candidate who's ever taken even the least bit seriously. And unlike them, Ross Perot has never held public office or even campaigned for one. He's in his 60s. He's a billionaire. He has the clout to go on TV and express his views whenever he wants. Why debase himself for the sake of a race that, in 1992, seems more unwinnable than ever? In March, Perot continues to play the role of reluctant hero, admitting that he hopes the Perot for President movement loses momentum so he can just get on with his life. He refuses to even take credit for said momentum, saying that people aren't even drawn to him specifically, but rather the possibility of the third option that he represents. Now, some say that he's being coy here, that he really has intended to run all along and just enjoys feeling selfless and deferential along the way. But I buy this from Ross. I really don't think he wants to do this. Well, bad news, buddy. An April 1st Gallup poll asked registered voters who they're with if this is indeed a three-way race. 44% say Bush, 25% say likely Dem nominee Bill Clinton, 24% Perot. He is statistically in a dead heat for second, and he has not even officially declared himself a candidate yet. People love to hear this guy talk, and not just those in his base, but Dem and GOP voters who are getting antsy and might be pried loose. He offers us a prime example on Face the Nation late in April. His crusade, of course, is to balance the federal budget, an incredibly boring and unglamorous issue, but listen to how he sells it.
Number one, we cannot spend our children's money. We are looking on the edge of a revolution of young people who are starting to realize that we, our generation, have put them $4 trillion in debt, and they don't like it, and they shouldn't. Don't we love our children as much as our parents loved us?
If I'm a registered voter who's watching this, suddenly, maybe I now care. Maybe he's got my attention. And unlike his opponents, he doesn't have an army of writers and PR people behind him to help him message things like this. In fact, he doesn't have any at all. This is just him. He also really knows how to work a crowd. In May, he addresses a gathering in Texas where he just quadrupled the required number of signatures needed to get on the ballot.
They said 53,000 signatures? Just regular folks can't do that.
That was the windup. Here's the pitch.
Well, you know, in all fairness to them, you did over 200,000.
Giving all the credit to his supporters dovetails perfectly with his image of the reluctant public servant, the hero who's called to lead by the people, the guy who is not in it for himself. It's this approach that's helped him slowly climb in the polls. Before this speech, he stood at 30%, 5 points behind Bush. After this speech, he moves into a tie for the lead. An independent candidate, a guy who has never run for office before, who has still not yet decided whether he's running right now, and who is doing a startling amount of this all by himself, is running neck and neck with the sitting president. In early June, he takes the lead outright. And then, in a poll published June 10th, he rockets to 38%. That is 8 points higher than Bush, 12 higher than Clinton. Anyone who has ever followed any race ever knows not to read too much into this. Things normalize. Around 4 months before Election Day, numerous polls suggest the three are about even. All the while, Perot is hammering together his platform while he's running on it. The longer he unofficially runs, the more it's beginning to dawn on him that he has to take positions on things that are not balancing the budget or campaign finance reform. When the candidates are asked for their positions on earmarking aid for inner cities, Perot answers, I don't know. Hold on. I am in the process of having an opinion about this. One issue Perot is clear on is abortion. He is unambiguously pro-choice, which seems to have the Bush camp terrified. They know their pro-life stance is unpopular, even with many in their own ranks, and since Perot is much more fiscally aligned with the GOP than the Democrats, they're scared that pro-choice Republicans are going to jump ship. This Bush-Perot battle, in fact, is drawing so much attention that Clinton is finding himself reduced to an irrelevant non-entity, just another Mondale-ish Dukakis-y Democrat who's just kinda there. Meanwhile, Ross Perot's star could not be higher. People are wondering whether he'll officially declare his candidacy on his birthday, June 27th. That comes and goes. People now wonder whether he'll set his marker on Independence Day. No dice. A poll published on July 9th indicates he retains a slight edge. And then July 10th happens. Two stories drop on the same day. In the first, some Perot staffers allege that the campaign maintains a hostile colors list to track and monitor those working in the campaign who are suspected to be disloyal and potentially traitorous. It's an early and illuminating indicator of his obsession with micromanagement and tendency to give in to paranoia. And second, Perot speaks at an NAACP convention in Nashville. It took some convincing from his staff, as he initially didn't even want to bother because he felt like he didn't need their support, which, of course, leads you to wonder exactly who he has and has not been speaking to all this time. During his speech, he refers to the black convention attendees as, quote, "you people." It's reported that some in the audience do audibly object to that, but Perot seems to not have heard him, and he calls them "you people" several more times. No, Ross. That's pretty bad. A couple of NAACP officials say that they don't believe he meant anything by it, but that it does show an embarrassing lack of effort on Perot's part to reach out to black Americans. The blowback rattles Perot big time. In fact, it's quite possible that this is the first time this 62-year-old Perot has known what it is to screw up, to fail on a substantial scale. He's never known anything but unimaginable success, fast-tracking from IBM salesman to third richest American, from naval officer to appendage of the deep state and super special secret agent guy, from independent 5'5" gimmick candidate to presidential frontrunner. All throughout, he has exclusively received the feedback that by virtue of his charisma, intellect, and doggedness, he can never fail. He can never get it wrong or get it any less than exactly right. But it has finally happened to him. Game over. It's not quite accurate to say Ross Perot quit because he'd never actually officially entered in the first place, but he's gone from frontrunner to common citizen in the space of about 1 week, in so doing, crushing the hopes and dreams of everybody who believed in him. Why? There is a 5-layer Mastroika doll of reasons. First, the terror of reckoning with the fact that America is not a simple place. Second, he knew that at some point soon he was gonna have to tell the American people he planned on hiking their taxes, which would have put a decisive end to his honeymoon. The third set of reasons is that he believes that Clinton has successfully maneuvered around him, mobilized the pro-choice vote, and cut him off at the pass, denying him a path to victory. He was worried that a 3-way delegate split would force the House of Representatives to decide the election. He said he'd lost the drive to be president, or maybe he never even had it to begin with. The fourth set of reasons is detailed by the Washington Post days later. He couldn't stand politics and couldn't bear the realities of running a modern campaign. He hired the best of the best advisors, but he hated every single thing they said. He thought mailing out flyers was stupid because he hated junk mail. He thought airing campaign ads was stupid because he could just go on talk shows for free. He wanted nothing to do with anything that was not plainly straightforward and simple. It all fed into an environment of fundamental disorganization. For example, the campaign made plans to recruit former Attorney General William French Smith as his running mate, until somebody finally noticed that Smith had been dead for nearly 2 years. The fifth, final, and most spectacular set of reasons is not revealed until October, and they seem to be the ones that decisively took him out of contention. Get ready for this. Perot claims he left the race after receiving word that the Bush campaign was planning to blackmail his daughter. The story goes they were going to digitally fabricate and distribute an image of her that implied she was a lesbian near her wedding day, and were also planning on disrupting her wedding with protests. Perot also claims that Bush's people had bugged his phone and were plotting with the CIA, which Bush was once in charge of, to hack into his stock trading system and prevent him from accessing funds. Bush's campaign, it should be said, categorically denies all of this. And in fact, eyeballing subsequent polls could lead one to the conclusion that the Bush campaign should have wanted Perot to remain in the race, because as soon as Perot leaves, Clinton immediately begins crushing him in the polls. In the space of a couple weeks, he's vaulted from the high 20s to the high 50s. It certainly looks as though the lion's share of Perot's voter base has migrated directly to Bill Clinton. That's not quite the whole story. Perot's exit coincides with the Democratic Convention, which has given Clinton a ton of momentum, and it's likely that even had Perot stayed in, he would have lost a number of pro-choice voters to Clinton. Even still, it seems that the Bush campaign's fears were very misplaced. Perot hadn't been cutting into Bush's votes. If anybody's, he was cutting into Clinton's. At least some political historians disagree with this, it should be noted. They argue that Perot, in fact, took votes from Clinton and Bush in more or less equal measure, if he took any at all. Whatever the case may be, this is now officially a two-horse race, but all the same, WAPO and ABC News pollsters get a little bit curious. In September, well over a month after Perot dropped out, they decide to slide his name into a poll alongside Bush and Clinton, and would you look at that? The guy who's no longer a candidate is still pulling 16%. After all, his name is still on the ballot, and he didn't technically quit because he didn't officially enter in the first place. Uh-oh. In September, Perot sets up a 1-800 number and invites people to call in to register their support. If his base has moved on from him, no hard feelings. But if they want him back, if they really, really want him back, he will jump right back into this race. Within the first hour alone, he gets 500,000 calls. You know, I think a key priority for Ross Perot during his candidacy has been to simply have a good time. He dropped his efforts once everything started being kind of a bummer, and now, after 2.5 months off, he gets to go straight to debate season, where he gets to put on a show, which is fun. Gone is his crack team of career campaign strategists whose ideas annoyed Perot to no end. They're replaced by his old buddy, Orson Swindle, who has perhaps the greatest crony name of all time, and who is not going to stand in Perot's way on anything. As the sort of quasi-official campaign chief, Swindle is steadfastly adhering to an atmosphere of unprofessionalism. Oh, you've been in politics before? You know what you're doing? Get the hell out of here. It's fine. It's gonna be fine. Politics isn't about winning, it's about having fun, having a good time, being yourself, and doing the things you enjoy. Debate season is finally here. After weeks of Bush ducking debates for so long it's as though he, the sitting president, is scared of Clinton. The two camps haggle endlessly about the specific format and rules of the debate. In the lead-up, they make sure to get plenty of reps in, running through mock debate after mock debate, fretting over their messaging, conceiving angles of attack. That shit is for nerds. Perot isn't doing any of it. Him and Orson Swindle are just gonna hang out instead. Again, It's gonna be okay. Don't worry about it. On October 11th in St. Louis, Bush, Clinton, and Perot meet up for the first of 3 debates. Perot nonchalantly strolls on stage, sizes up their neurotically manicured talking points, and beats their asses with a strong plurality of likely voters feeling that he won decisively. He makes the crowd pop early and often, just a few minutes in, responding to his lack of experience as a politician.
Well, they've got a point. I don't have any experience in running up a $4 trillion debt.
A few minutes later, stealing moderator Jim Lehrer's line.
And people who are in charge,
Your time
is up.
Time is up.
Still within the first half hour, making a goof on his big ears that have delighted political cartoonists nationwide.
We've got to collect the taxes to do it. If there's a fairer way, I'm all ears.
Later on, he does something you never see in a debate. He's so confident he's won over the room that he holds for applause.
Pot's all broken to pieces after November the 3rd.
While the clock is still ticking on his allotted time. And then he just keeps going. This is something neither Bush nor Clinton would ever try. They don't have the juice. It goes on like this all night. Still, on a couple of occasions, Perot laments his inability to explore complex issues within this time-restrictive debate format.
And we have got to fix it. And that's about all I can say in a minute. We've got, I can't handle that in a minute, but I hope we can get back into it later.
No problem. That's what his TV show's for. Just a few days prior, he threw CBS a barrel of money to buy an entire 30-minute time slot and spent the entire show sitting at his desk going on and on and on about charts he drew himself. So, let me get this straight. A half-hour-long video where some dork just sits there and talks about charts the whole time? Who would ever watch that? Well, 16 million people would, it turns out. He even beats Quantum Leap in the ratings. It goes over so well that he buys a second time slot, this time on Friday night on ABC, which is right in the middle of the beloved TGIF lineup. Sorry, kids. And guess what? It's not even a new video. It's a rerun of the first one. Remember those tax hikes he was once too scared to talk about? Not anymore.
You folks are going to sit there and watch me talk about all the taxes I'm going to raise on you, and you're not going to like it?
Other tax increases. Here's one you don't like. Raise the gasoline tax.
And you're going to like it. As we enter debate number 2 in Richmond, Virginia, it's important to remember that Perot's opponents, Bush in particular, obsessed endlessly over the terms and formats and minutiae of every single debate. Perot doesn't care about any of that. He doesn't care about the format. He doesn't care about these optics. He doesn't care that they made the chairs really tall so that the 5'5" Ross Perot looks as tall standing up as they do sitting down. He can get off his goofs from sea level and even get a laugh out of the moderator.
And the dollar's gone through the floor. Now, whose fault is that? Not the Democrats, not the Republicans. Somewhere out there, there's an extraterrestrial that's doing this to us, I guess.
Now, here he's talking about the national debt, which I cared even less about then than I do now. I watched this live. I had just turned 10 years old. I had no politics, so I was free to just like the guy, which I did. I think I just felt represented in watching this, both as a kid who liked funny jokes and a kid who was 4'6". Clinton wins this debate handily, thanks in part to everybody in America noticing when George H.W. Bush checked his watch during a question from the audience. But viewers named Perot the winner of the third and final debate. These performances go a long way toward galvanizing his support, which has about doubled to 19% since re-entering the race. Kind of incredibly, that mark remains perfectly in place throughout the remaining polls, and his final showing in the popular vote, 18.9%, mirrors those polls almost perfectly. A short little guy with big ears, who belonged to no party, who had zero experience in electoral politics and ignored and fired everyone around him who did no debate prep and pretty much winged it through 3 nationally televised debates, who promised to jack up Americans' taxes, who during peak campaign season just kinda wandered off and then wandered back in a couple months later, and who on multiple occasions said he didn't even really want to be president, wrestled away about 1/5 of the popular vote from political institutions thought to be invulnerable to such a challenge. The haters among us, of which there are many, will rightly point out that he didn't come very close to carrying any one state. He only placed as high as second in a couple of districts, and he therefore received 0 electoral votes, indicating that victory was never a serious possibility. In that case, I would argue that our definition of victory needs a little bit of work. Because in fact, By winning 18.9% of the popular vote, Ross Perot has done more than make history. He has built the future. Well, he's built a future, at least. You ever notice this box on your 1040 tax form asking you to donate a couple bucks to presidential campaign funds? Why not shelters or public schools or something? Why this, of all things? It's ridiculous. It feels like tipping your landlord. But if you do tick this box, the Federal Elections Commission funnels it to parties or candidates who accrued at least 5% of the popular vote in the most recent presidential election for use in the next general election. It comes in the form of matching funds. This program was first introduced in the 1970s, the idea being that it would mitigate the impact of large donors and prevent candidates from having to spend all their time fundraising. Perot, of course, nearly quadrupled that 5% threshold, which has secured him approximately $29 million in federal matching funds for the 1996 general election. Good news, everybody! The billionaire with libertarian leanings is receiving tens of millions of dollars in government handouts. The downside for Perot is that as a condition of accepting these funds, the billionaire will be prohibited from spending much of his own money. The upside is that it offers a future in which he can run somebody besides himself. And as we'll see pretty clearly in the run-up to the 96 election, they need somebody else in the worst way. Perot is an independent candidate whose movement doesn't count as an official political party. In August of '95, when he's asked about the possibility of forming a third party, he says it would take way too long, and he doesn't have that kind of time. In fact, he seems pretty over politics in general, saying he'd have to be crazy to jump back into the political arena. It's the opposite of the business world he comes from, he says, where everything is rational and adds up and makes sense. The political sphere is an alien world to him. He's seen it, he's lived in it, he hates it. It's a fundamentally irrational and stupid experience. The last thing on earth he is ever going to do is form a political party. So anyways, a month later he announces he's forming a political party. Along the way, he makes a couple of particularly dubious claims. The first is that he says he doesn't want to be about him. Ross, man, don't believe you. The second is that he declares this party will be weirdo-proof, that weirdos are not going to be able to find any purchase here. I am going to stick a pin in this one so we can all have a laugh about it down the road, because this is perhaps the least true thing that has ever been said. This brand new third party is to be called the Independence Party. Actually, wait, it's called the Reform Party. Okay, so it's going to be called either the Independence Party or the Reform Party. Wait. Actually, I think it's called the Independence Reform Party. Okay, so here's the deal. It's going to be called the Independence Party in most states and the Reform Party in states where the name Independence Party is taken. No, not even this is right. It's going to be, for real this time, the Reform Party nationally and in most states, and the Independence Party in a few other states. Got it? The first step of this party's million-step staircase to the presidency is simply this. What is your name? That's it. Just say your name. And they've already face-planted. That is what this is going to be like. In '96, Ross Perot starts shopping for a presidential candidate. He declares that he is looking for, quote, George Washington II, and insists over and over that he is not talking about himself, despite some pollsters bracketing him in a three-way race with Clinton and likely GOP nominee Bob Dole anyway. Entering June, he's been polling in the mid to high teens, indicating his base hasn't gone anywhere. Seems as though everyone but Ross Perot knows Ross Perot is running. Perot's camp was originally hoping for either Bill Bradley or Colin Powell, who's massively popular at the moment, but neither one is interested. Then they look at the second stringers, David Boren, Lowell Weicker, Tim Penny. No luck there either. As we speak, this race's incumbent candidate is cruising, and the challenger, Dole, has had the GOP nomination sewn up for months. Time is running out for the Reform Party. Finally, Perot finds his man. Former Colorado Governor Dick Lamb, none other than Governor Gloom himself. Lamb became famous for making fire and brimstone speeches warning that Americans were doomed unless they balanced the budget. In his most famous and infamous moment as governor, he stated that things like artificial hearts are too much trouble and that old people who need them should just die and get out of the way. It feels a little bit funny to place Lamb, a former Democrat, to the right of HW on social issues, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm not overly confident in my placement of him here because he offers an idiosyncratic collection of positions that only a Coloradoan can produce. He's a hardline fiscal conservative who fearmongers about both the dangers of multiculturalism and the threat of climate change. Those two don't usually go together, but if there's something to monger about, he's there. The man loves to mong. Although he never appears to have said so, I wonder whether Perot takes a beat here, looks back on how unpopular his own candidacy became once he had to start delivering bad news, and contemplates whether Governor Gloom is a guy he can count on to claim 5% of the vote in '96 and keep those matching funds rolling into the future. There's also the question of whether Perot, who didn't run on the reform ticket in '92 as it didn't exist yet, will be allowed to transfer those matching funds to anybody else. They might be for him and only him. No one really seems to know. So let's try to imagine Perot's horror when Lamb officially declares his intention to seek the reform nomination despite being broke as a joke, and then immediately presents a platform almost custom engineered to make everybody hate him. He wants to raise the retirement age, take a battle axe to Social Security, and yank away benefits from military veterans. I mean, at this rate, he's probably a week away from trying to make Jolly Ranchers a Schedule I drug. Ross has got to do something. And he does! Richard Lamb's 48-hour tenure as the presumptive reform nominee is over. It is yet another classic Ross Perot doubleback, only this time it does seem to be the right call. Because, as it turns out, Lamb would not have been able to access the matching funds after all. Perot effortlessly defeats the guy he himself recruited in the reform primary, made all the easier because he hoarded party mailing lists and wouldn't share them with Lamb. That's gonna be a running theme. Anyway, Perot takes the matching funds and runs a very low-effort campaign that aptly illustrates how badly the Reform Party needs him to pass the torch to somebody else. Earlier in the year, a college student once asked him how the Reform Party will be different from the two major parties. It was a perfect opportunity for him to make his pitch. Instead, he told her to get lost. Campaigning makes him cranky. He seems to hate it even more than he did in '92. So much so that he runs a front porch campaign, rarely emerging from his Dallas studio. In fact, they don't even call it a front porch campaign, they call it a cocoon campaign. Entering October, he's still only held one rally in public, and he appears hellbent on talking to voters exclusively through the TV screen, be it through debates or more of his 30-minute infomercials. Predictably, he fades in the polls and is nowhere near the 15% threshold required to actually participate in those debates. The networks, who are now preoccupied with trying to compete with Seinfeld rather than just Quantum Leap, will not sell him the primo time slots he wants. Perot, after running another campaign in which he refuses to do anything that is not fun, finishes with 8.4% of the popular vote in a race that everybody always knew was going to go to Bill Clinton. With this showing, Perot is eternally burnished as a political sideshow attraction, an irrelevant, desperate caricature. A loser. Once again, though, I take issue with that. For one, who else can earn 8 million American votes despite not traveling or speaking to crowds or even really trying? And while plenty of people did cackle at Perot's support melting to less than half of what it was in '92, the important thing is that he cleared that 5%. He brought the ball over the line, and this time he did so as the official reform candidate. This means that next time, he actually will be able to transfer his matching funds to somebody else. In the years leading up to the 2000 presidential election, the specter of Perot will continue to loom over the Reform Party, with both people inside and outside expecting him to re-emerge as a candidate on any given day. But he won't. He's had enough. He is totally spent as a front-facing political force, and he knows it. Leaving us all to wonder where, exactly, his ceiling might have been had he not bailed a week removed from the peak of his powers in '92. You know, I think it's entirely possible that, weirdly enough, he actually did better as a result of having gone on vacation. There were surely plenty of other missteps and gaffes like his NAACP disaster that awaited him had he continued to campaign conventionally. In this way, he got to fast forward right past You People Perot to get to Debate Perot, which was the best version of himself. All the same, it does lead you to wonder what else might have gone on within these 10 weeks, for better or for worse. How things might have been different. Speaking of, do you remember those accusations of blackmail, the precipitating factor that finally pushed Perot out of the race? Well, Perot was tipped off by an old acquaintance of his, a guy named Scott Barnes. The two had bonded over the shared experience of falling for a widespread conspiracy theory alleging that there were still way more POWs being held in Vietnam than there actually were, and that the government was covering it up. In Barnes, Perot saw a compelling and trustworthy individual, a man who'd worked for the CIA and DEA, and a commando who'd infiltrated Laos to free American soldiers. In other words, a man who'd appealed to Perot's admiration of super-secret G.I. Joe guys and likely desire to be one himself. So, when Barnes confided in Perot that he himself had been hired by the Bush campaign to wiretap Perot's phones, Perot believed him. When Barnes said Bush's people were plotting to blackmail his daughter, Perot believed him, and when Barnes failed to produce any evidence, Perot defended him in the press. 5 years later, it's 1997. Scott Barnes has become a born-again Christian and has begun the process of accounting for his sins. It's during this process that he talks to the Dallas Morning News and confesses that he made all of it up. All of it. Barnes never worked for the DEA, he never worked for the CIA, he was never a commando, he never went on any POW rescue missions. There was absolutely no plot on behalf of the Bush campaign, nor anybody else, to tap Perot's phones or blackmail his daughter. The primary reason why Ross Perot abandoned one of the most shockingly successful campaigns in American history was 100% a complete lie. Barnes' stated motivation, confusingly, was that he believed President Bush hadn't done enough to free all those alleged POWs and was determined to take him down at all costs. Presumably, Barnes was hoping that Perot would go public with these accusations and use them as a bludgeon against Bush. Instead, Barnes' stories spooked Perot so badly that he just up and quit instead. And apparently unwilling to expose himself as a fraud, Barnes just let Perot keep on believing it. So much is to be learned of Ross Perot from this. Even at the time, Barnes' reputation as a compulsive liar and complete fraud was widespread within both the government and the media. He'd been peddling bullshit for so many years that he could no longer find anybody to believe any of it, until he found Perot. I know this is a tough argument to make at this moment, but Perot is an exceedingly smart man. He really is. He's a man of terrific intellect. It's so implausible that he would fall for a single-source story like this, to the extent that you wonder whether this whole thing was just a piece of theater to give Ross an excuse to quit. Except Barnes so fully committed himself to these stories that he actually lied to Congress, which is of course a disastrous spot to put yourself in legally. This seems to have been how it went down. Ross really bought it. Ross Perot and I are very far apart politically. In the interest of transparency, I personally would not vote for him. The disinterest in even meeting with the NAACP in the first place tells me he lacks a true and complete understanding of the people who actually live here. But given who he was running against, given that he demonstrated that something else, anything else was on the table, he had that, and he threw it away for the emptiest of reasons. It's hard for me to articulate my feelings here. I guess I'm just so hacked off. How did these lies get their hooks in a guy like this? It had to have been his tendency to give into paranoia and conspiracy theories, whether it was the supposed 50 billion prisoners of war languishing in Southeast Asia, or his own campaign volunteers plotting his downfall. Or maybe even that weird story about the Black Panthers and North Vietnamese conspiring to murder him. Maybe somebody told him that's what went down and he just bought it. Who knows? Honestly, who knows? Admittedly, and amazingly, he was right to be paranoid. He was right to be suspicious of those in his own camp. He just didn't think it would come from someone so close to him. In light of all this, well, thank God he was never president. It would seem that anyone is capable of talking him into anything as long as he's promised that somebody's out to get him. So now, knowing all this, you might conclude that all these efforts were a complete waste of time, that the momentum generated by Jack Gargan has been squandered. that all the people who volunteered and campaigned and voted for Perot were hoodwinked, and that this movement is no movement at all. It's just a billionaire's funhouse subsidized by federal matching money. But the story of the Reform Party has barely begun. A new figure is finally about to emerge within this party, the type of figure Ross has been searching for. A political force worthy of being handed the torch. Who is capable of establishing the Reform Party as a legitimate political entity and who can do something Ross Perot never could? Win. Hey everybody, John here. I promise I'm just about to get out of your way. Before I do, I just wanted to make sure I gave a very special shout out to everybody who subscribes to Secret Base's Patreon channel. You made this possible, you made a lot of other stuff possible, and in the months to come, you're going to make even more stuff possible, including monthly episodes of Pretty Good from me that Patreon subscribers will see months before they drop on YouTube. If you were a Patreon subscriber from the jump, you might not be watching this, because you got to see Reform, 4 or 5 months ago? If you are watching, thank you so much. And if you would like to subscribe and see what it's all about, patreon.com/secretbase. All right, thanks everybody. With that said, enjoy part 2 of Reform. Let's return once again to the fall of 1990. 2 fuses have been lit. First, Jack Gargan has taken out a series of full-page newspaper ads demanding we vote every single elected official out of office, and what now looks like little more than birdcage lining will in fact directly build momentum for Ross Perot's independent run for president in 1992. That in turn will birth the Reform Party, the only third party of modern American times to ever earn respect as even a quasi-major player. At the same time, Brooklyn Park, Minnesota resident Jesse Ventura enters the political arena. Although he's initially motivated by a desire to save local wetlands from developers, he, like Gargan, is disgusted with career politicians, has a campaign slogan that's very similar to Gargan's, and shares Gargan's interest in limiting their terms. Ventura runs for mayor of Brooklyn Park, population about 50,000, and cruises to victory over his opponent, an 18-year incumbent who, before the race is over, expresses a sort of awe. He's never seen a communicator quite like Ventura. If the American people know Jesse Ventura, they know him as the Body, or Cooper from Predator, or Captain Freedom from The Running Man. He's so gigantic and hyper-masculine it borders on caricature. His indoor speaking voice sounds like an idling Harley Davidson. It takes a little bit of work to show the voting public that he's not, in fact, the reactionary many might assume him to be. Granted, he does lean libertarian economically. On the matter of healthcare, he sounds like a Reaganite, decrying the state's Medicaid program as, quote, socialized medicine. His relationship with unions is pretty interesting. Even after he berates AFL-CIO leaders for not supporting him, they still seem to kinda like him. Meanwhile, he swings pretty far to the left on many social issues, and not in the passive libertarian do-whatever-you-want kind of way. He is vocally pro-choice and is pro-gay rights in an era when that is pretty atypical. He took a lot of heat as mayor of Brooklyn Park for simply arguing that people of color should have more of a say politically. Most uniquely, he maintains a firmly anti-war footing and was one of the very few public figures to speak out against the first Gulf War, the quote-unquote good war in the public imagination. In keeping with his principles and his word, Ventura declines to seek a second term as mayor of Brooklyn Park. It's not long before he pulls himself right back into politics, affiliating himself with the Minnesota branch of the Reform Party. Ventura is a great fit for the Reform platform, even facetiously, because what is the Reform Party if not a literal, straight-faced answer to a Ziggy comic strip? You know, the kind of stuff Ziggy says, like, Republican Party, Democratic Party, heck, I'd rather have a pizza party. Okay, here's the third pizza party you have requested. These days, you can't tell the difference between politics and the dang WWF. Okay, roger that. In terms of persona and intrigue, it's safe to say Ventura has got the juice and is the first one to come around here who rivals Perot in this department. He tilts right fiscally as other reformers do, while pulling the party a little bit to the left socially. He's a real politician with real established positions, but it's still unsurprising that most observers take it as a joke when he expresses interest in entering the 1998 Minnesota governor's race. At the outset, it looks as hopeless as Gargan's newspaper ads once did. He's up against Republican Norm Coleman, the entrenched mayor of St. Paul who's riding a wave of goodwill after bringing the NHL back to Minnesota, and Democrat Skip Humphrey, the even more entrenched son of a former vice president and Minnesota senator. There's a lot less precedent for celebrity politicians in 1998 than there will be in the 21st century. I mean, at least Ronald Reagan and Sonny Bono were mainstream figures. Ventura has the stink of the silly, unserious WCW and WWF all over him. He isn't getting a lot of media play, and his campaign doesn't have the money to get him on TV, so he has few chances to defy anybody's expectations as Coleman and Humphrey dominate the airwaves. In late September, just 6 weeks prior to the election, voters still don't really know what Ventura is about. They haven't had the chance to find out. It's not that they see him negatively, it's just that they don't see him, period. Consequently, he sometimes isn't even listed as an option on polls, and when he is, he floats around 10%. Name recognition is probably the only thing keeping him that high. He seems destined to languish there as a protest candidate, an option that polled likely voters only select because it's a more fun, eccentric way of saying, I have no opinion. But debate season changed everything for Ross Perot in '92, and here, it'll change everything for Jesse Ventura. Early in the first debate, Humphrey and Coleman are squabbling over some supposed misquote nobody cares about, when some deft camera work, and equally deft Jesse Ventura, make it clear.
Well, I think it shows obviously who's above all of this, doesn't it?
This is a three-man race. Humphrey, in particular, doesn't seem to appreciate this fact. He keeps attacking Coleman, ignoring Ventura entirely, even though it's clear Ventura is racking up huge points, framing these two as no different from their Washington counterparts, and no different from each other. Minutes later, when Coleman, who in the past has been both a Democrat and a Republican, trots out the usual reach across the aisle stuff.
It is about getting things done. It is about working hand in hand with folks on both sides of the aisle.
Ventura is perfectly positioned to jump all over him.
I'd like to say you're right, Mr. Coleman. You have been on both sides of the aisle. I'm not sure if you're a Republican or Democrat, because as mayor of St. Paul, you've been both.
The people of Minnesota like what they see. Ventura makes modest gains in the polls. His odds, while still long, now float somewhere north of impossible. But he's running out of money. He can't find a bank that'll offer his campaign a loan. See, there is a 5% financing rule in play here, although it works a little bit different than it did for Perot. Ventura's got a $300,000 public subsidy waiting for him after Election Day, and wants a loan that he will pay off with that subsidy. Thing is, if he doesn't reach 5% of the popular vote, deal's off, he gets no money to pay off that loan. And although Ventura is well above that line in the polls, it would seem the banks just aren't buying it. They don't think he's for real. So, entering the final weeks of the campaign, Ventura can't even afford to buy any TV spots, which in 1990s politics spells disaster. This is tragic for the Reform Party. Their most viable and high-profile candidate, of course, has been Ross Perot, who earned about 19% of the popular vote in the '92 presidential election. But Perot, the billionaire, had to spend about $60 million to get there, buying entire half-hour primetime slots on broadcast TV. And now here we have Ventura, the reform candidate who's polling about as high as Perot was with a shoestring budget. Not only does Ventura have the juice, he is the only potential candidate in the Reform Party who has any juice at all. Perot's viability as a candidate is spent, he knows it, everybody knows it. Behind him are a bunch of jobbers who've run for Congress, the House, the Senate, and collected 3% of the vote if they're lucky. The bench is empty. Ventura is the Reform Party's last chance, its only chance, of making something of itself. In desperation, Ventura's campaign reaches out to National Reform Party headquarters down in Dallas, asking them for a cash infusion. They're not asking for anything close to what the Democrats and Republicans are working with, just a little bit to help them get over the line. Ross Perot says no. And if that isn't the most Reform Party turn of events possible, I don't know what is. $20,000 That's all we were talking about here. For a campaign as broke as Ventura's, that is a meaningful amount. To Perot, the billionaire, that's less than nothing. And although a Ventura defeat does seem like a done deal, chipping in would represent a perfect opportunity to demonstrate that the Reform Party really is bigger than Ross Perot, that others who run on the Reform ticket can expect support. Ventura campaign chairman Dean Barkley charges that this is just the continuation of a petty grudge, that Perot has had it out for the Minnesota Reform Party ever since '96. In that year's Reform Party primary, Minnesota was one of the only states to go to challenger Richard Lamb. Forgotten, apparently, is the '92 campaign when many of the very same people in this Minnesota contingent built one of Perot's most effective and passionate bases of support nationwide. This rift can't be a matter of issues. Ventura is by no means hacking the party name for his own gain. In fact, his platform is very much in line with the national parties. Who knows what the truth really is? Maybe Perot does hold a grudge, maybe they just asked this eternally indecisive man at the wrong time of day. Maybe his ego just can't tolerate the potential emergence of a guy who shares Perot's political positioning, outsider mystique, and gift for drumming up attention, but who, in stark contrast to Perot, is big, imposing, thunderous, and most crucially, and most unlike Perot, decisive and impossible to scare off. Whatever the case might be, Perot does exactly what he did in '92. When he's needed the most, when the opportunity is greatest, he shrugs and he walks away. But you know, there's a scene in The Running Man in which Ventura's character, Captain Freedom, is ordered to come out of retirement and hunt Arnold Schwarzenegger down live on national TV. And they strap all this shitty, useless armor on him because they think it'll play well on TV.
I don't need this crap. This stuff is garbage.
This crap represents all the things you're supposed to require to win a major election. Major party affiliations, soft money, friends in the establishment. Jesse doesn't need any of it. He has something more powerful.
This is a sport of death and honor. Go to the gladiators.
He has himself. A week later, Ventura finally does secure a desperately needed loan, albeit for far less than what his opponents are working with. His campaign nonetheless buys a couple of TV ads that ingeniously play into the things that Jesse Ventura, and only Jesse Ventura, can pull off. Skip Humphrey could not in a million years convincingly sell the idea that kids would actually play with his action figure.
This bill wastes taxpayer money. Read, draft it.
Norm Coleman could not in a million years cut a campaign ad in which he sits there a loincloth removed from full-on butt-ass naked. That's all it took. Just a little bit of money was all it took to elevate him from interesting also-ran to serious threat. Coleman and Humphrey had spent so much time attacking each other that by late October they've almost run out of time to figure out what to do about Ventura. By the end of the month he's only about 10 points behind both of them in the polls. He's even nice enough to slap together a little October surprise for his opponents. Hey guys, look at me. I want to decriminalize sex work and drugs. There you go, enjoy. Unsurprisingly, both opponents raced to condemn Ventura and his remarks as outrageous, unsafe, scary. Ventura responds, "The war on drugs has failed. Get over it, losers." Having watched this entire dust-up unfold, voters are polled once again on the candidates, and Ventura goes that way. It's nice, no doubt, but he's still looking up at not one but two candidates who are locked in a dead heat with one another. Because of that, both are about to empty out massive war chests to take one another down. Both belong to parties that have worked Minnesota for eons and have hoarded reams of voter data. The Ventura campaign has none of that. They'll be flying blind and broke throughout the entire final week, a week in which, it's pointed out, elections are typically decided by the campaign's ability to organize. So maybe Reform isn't ready to win just yet. Regardless, pundits across the country now recognize Ventura as a force to be taken seriously, a candidate who might actually spoil this thing and steal enough votes from the faltering Humphrey to give the election to Coleman. Doing so would, in and of itself, prove that the Reform Party is more than just Ross Perot's vanity project. Other candidates could run under this banner, influence elections, if not win them outright, and give the major parties something to be afraid of. For that reason, this is a victory no matter what. The point has been made, the shot across the bow has landed. Jesse Ventura is not going to win, and that is okay.
1998, and the American dream lives on in Minnesota as we shock the world.
That is not hyperbole on Ventura's part. This shocked the world not only because a pro wrestler took down a Humphrey in the state of Minnesota, not only because he did so on an impossibly tight budget, but because he did so by accomplishing one of the most difficult things in American politics, drawing out the youth vote in large numbers. Further, he won this thing on the issues. This was not the gimmick campaign it first appeared to be. Ventura has found a variant of the Reform Party platform that can win. He's demonstrated that the stock reform model of fiscal conservatism, combining with waving the white flag on social issues, is not enough. You can't just meekly punk out on things like women's rights and gay rights the way libertarians do. If you proactively advocate for and champion these things and appeal directly to the people who care about them, you can get there. Suddenly, and almost impossibly, this concept of the powerful third party in modern American politics has now found a second life. Up ahead is the 2000 presidential election, where thanks to Ross Perot's showing in the 96 election, $12.6 million in guaranteed matching federal funds are waiting for the Reform Party nominee. This is the number around which everything and everybody will orbit from this point forward. It's a far cry from the $67 million the Republican and Democratic nominees will receive, but it's enough to get a winning message out there if they have one. It would seem that they do. Once again, there is more than one definition of winning. In 2000, winning will mean regaining ground in the popular vote and keeping the matching funds train rolling well into the future, and the timing couldn't be better. This will be an election in which both major party candidates are rolling into the general as damaged goods, with George W. Bush surviving a tough primary and VP Al Gore trying to distance himself from his scandal-ridden president, Bill Clinton. These two demonstrate that this political spectrum chart is really starting to fail us. On paper, they stand far apart, creating the illusion that they offer voters two distinct choices, but the one thing the Reform Party has always been right about is that the Dems and GOPs are both beholden to the man behind the curtain. Neither will challenge the military-industrial complex, neither will turn their backs on corporations. It is reasonable to assume that the future will be very different depending on which of these two are elected, but in practice, the gap between them is much smaller than it appears. And most reformers would argue there is no meaningful gap at all. If they can do what they did in '98 and run someone not named Ross Perot and continue to surpass 5% of the popular vote to lock in matching funds for the future, that will count as liftoff. And it's not exclusively a long play either. Showings like this can help precipitate results here and now. You remember Jack Gargan's primary grievance that kicked off this entire thing? That $3 trillion national debt? Well, guess what? On an annual basis, at least, we've dug ourselves out of it. Gargan took out those newspaper ads in 1990, a year in which the national deficit surpassed $200 billion. In our time, it's way, way bigger than that, and very few of us seem to even notice or give a shit. But the point is, in the 90s, people really do care about this. And look what started happening in 92, the year Perot first started campaigning on this. The deficit gradually disappeared. In 2000, we're going to be running an annual surplus for the third straight year. But I can't blame reformers for placing the win in their own column. They believed their agenda was co-opted by the major parties, who realized they had to do something to quell this 19% uprising. Maybe, at some point far down the line, the Reform Party can win the presidency, but until then, it's possible they can successfully push forward their agenda regardless. They can win without winning. What this also means, of course, is that they no longer have the deficit to run on. Their platform's biggest plank has been rendered unnecessary. Reformers are going to have to redefine themselves, make new promises, deliver a new message. What will that message be? To do that, the party is going to have to patch itself up in the wake of Ventura's victory. These two major reform powers will have to forge an alliance. The one thing we cannot have on our hands here is Ventura versus Perot. First things first, Ross Perot has to eat his crow. He comes crawling back to Ventura, of course, declaring this a monumental win for the Reform Party. His right-hand man in Dallas, Russ Verney, says Ventura will bring about a new day in politics. Russ Verney, that is a name to know, and this is the time to start talking about factions. We're going to keep things as simple as we can here because it'll get hopelessly confusing otherwise. I'll give you a couple of examples. Back in '97, a splinter group of reformers were unhappy with Ross's recent shenanigans en route to strong-arming Dick Lamb out of the party nomination, so they broke off into the American Reform Party and mounted an extremely unsuccessful effort to argue that the future matching funds belonged to them. Not long after, we saw another offshoot in the founding of the very real, officially registered Reform Silly Party, which advocates that all Americans should be drafted into getting married at age 25 and that all politicians should serve 2 terms and then be executed by the state. These 2 offshoots, believe it or not, achieve an identical degree of irrelevance. In Florida, for example, both parties boast just over 50 registered members. So hopefully this gives you a taste of how Byzantine this can all get and makes it clear why I'm sticking with 2 sides named Side 1 and Side 2. There will be about a dozen major players on the national level with a Reform Party, and there will be so many switchings of sides that neither side will have any coherent, consistent position at all other than Side 1 opposing Side 2 and Side 2 opposing Side 1. Side 1, for now, harbors an alliance of Jack Gargan and Ross Perot. Orson Swindle was once here, but he had a falling out with Perot and soon left the party altogether. Same for Dick Lamb, who Perot recruited to the party and then very quickly got bored with. Ventura, for the moment, is aligned with the Perot faction by default, which brings us to Russ Verney. Verney, the chairman of the Reform Party, is unshakably loyal to Ross Perot. He's sort of Perot's Larry Middleman figure, a guy who serves as his surrogate and carries out his wishes verbatim, including, as Richard Lamb alleged, helping concoct the mailing list shenanigans that hampered his failed nomination. A good rule of thumb going forward, whenever Russ Verney says something, it's as though Perot himself said it. But Ventura sees all these kind words for exactly what they are. They would certainly prefer for everybody to forget that just 1 month prior, Perot slammed the door on him, refusing to even throw him walking around money. Ventura has not forgotten, and just a day after his historic win, he's already considering disaffiliating with the National Party and making the Minnesota chapter independent. Soon after, he calls out Perot in the press and says he should not even think about making a 3rd presidential run in 2000. And if Perot did harbor any interest in running again, it's quite possible that Ventura's thumbs down just killed it. Ventura now overshadows Perot as figuratively as he does literally. In a world just a little bit different, one in which Perot could stifle his general Perotness for just a little bit, this could have been an elegant passing of the torch. Everybody could have looked good. Something more substantial might have been built. And while Ventura does ultimately decide to keep the Minnesota Reform Party coupled with the National Party for the time being, he has very clearly told Ross Perot to get lost. This Minnesota-Dallas rivalry never ends, does it? If it's not the Drew Pearson Hail Mary, if it's not the Herschel Walker trade, if it's not Dallas stealing Minnesota's hockey team, it's this. While the meaningful differences between Side 1 and Side 2 will soon become completely inscrutable, here in 1998 the line is clearly drawn. You're either with the Dallas faction or with the Minnesota faction. Ventura doesn't seem very interested in wresting control of the National Party himself, but he does want to limit Perot's influence. Step 1 is to extract Russ Verney, the party chairman, the unquestioned Perot loyalist, but who to replace him with? Ventura is the party newcomer, and handpicking one of his own people would start a riot. So, Ventura throws his weight behind the true believer, the man who started it all, our old friend, Jack Gargan. Since we last left him, Gargan has unsuccessfully run for a number of offices, most recently for the House of Representatives in '98 as the Reform candidate, and although he lost, he'd claimed about a third of the vote against an incumbent Democrat, which appears to be the best Reform performance to date from anybody not named Jesse Ventura. So on paper it makes sense, and it certainly doesn't hurt that Gargan has lost faith in Perot entirely. He's among a pretty substantial chunk of former Perot supporters who bailed on him after he bailed on them back in '92. So, Jack Gargan, welcome to Side 2. As we can see, Perot kinda has a way of repelling former allies, doesn't he? A couple days later, Ventura puts a point on it, declaring that if they don't get Russ Verney out of the office of party chair, Ventura is taking his ball and going home. A week later, like clockwork, Verney announces he will not seek another term. He insists that Ventura's ultimatum had nothing to do with it, but it does have the desired effect. A few weeks after that, at the Reform Convention, Jack Gargan is voted in as party chair. Pretty ruthless series of moves by Ventura here, and ones that were probably necessary. Ross Perot was essential in the early going because he was the rarest of things, a billionaire who knew how to talk to America and convinced a very large chunk of it that he recognized its problems and cared about solving them. But a potential third presidential run for Perot would probably extinguish this movement entirely and had to be cut off at the pass. And it's hard not to be happy for Jack, who's always embodied the core convictions of this movement better than anybody, who, unlike Perot, has never wavered, never waffled. At the same convention in which Gargan is elected as party chair, Perot addresses the Reform Party for the final time in an official capacity. He uses this opportunity to try to recast his image as one of an elder statesman and unifier, calling for the party to overcome petty differences and come together.
The last thing I want is all of these things that I see in the paper day in and day out about catfights and this and that and the other that have nothing to do with fact, but make great fiction. And I think if we are, just remember, united teams win and divided teams lose.
That's advice that he, of course, has never taken. And in fact, it's his own meddling and indecisiveness that's created these fissures in the first place. But in this moment, he gives the impression that he wants to be that guy, that revered father of the party, that some of him perhaps wishes he was that guy. But it's just not in him. He can't sit still. He's about to fade into the shadows, but even from there, he's about to pull one last lever, touch one final hot stove that will deliver chaos upon this Reform Party unlike anything else it has ever seen. See, Perot is quietly, yet decisively, lobbying for the man who he believes should be the Reform Party candidate for president in the 2000 election. This man is Pat Buchanan. This cast of characters, both the ones you've met and the ones you haven't yet, is one made up of imperfect people with quirks, eccentricities, flaws, and failings. Pat Buchanan's definitional quality, the one that sets him far apart from the rest of these remarkable people, is that he is a big bag of shit. He is a man of comprehensively awful beliefs who has been one for a long, long time, and in fact it's here that Buchanan necessitates a content advisory. He'll be a major figure throughout the remainder of this story, and it isn't possible to accurately portray him without cataloging all the racist, anti-Semitic, sexist, and homophobic things that he said and that he stands for, so there's the advisory. If you're still up for it, let's examine the track record of one Pat Buchanan. In 1977, Buchanan felt compelled to write that although Adolf Hitler committed genocide, he was nonetheless an individual of great courage and genius. While a Republican in the late 70s, before the GOP had become the fully reactionary engine it is today, he was hell-bent on taking it there, arguing that the GOP should simply give up trying to represent or appeal to black voters entirely. He's obsessed with white birth rates falling below those of people of color, calling it, quote, racial suicide. He has dabbled in Holocaust denialism. He's come to the defense of Nazis who have been accused of war crimes. He endorses the belief that white people are genetically, intellectually superior. He describes immigrants as invaders unless, and this is important, they're white. He approvingly cites and amplifies things written by neo-Nazis. He says that women are genetically inferior intellectually to men. He argues that Holocaust survivors are making too big a deal of the Holocaust. He believes America should legislate exactly how many people of each race should live here. He calls gay people Satanists. All this is only a small sample of the garbage he spent decades dumping in books and spouting on TV. How is he even allowed into polite society to begin with? Well, having worked in the Nixon and Reagan White Houses, as well as having been a newspaper columnist and talk show circuit regular, he bears the credentials of a person who surely couldn't be that bad, surely couldn't be this bigoted. You couldn't ask for a more edifying window into how a lot of media really works than this. In 2017, Buchanan's one-time MSNBC co-host will describe his views as, quote, abhorrent, but will look past it because he's a nice guy. To him. That's really all it takes. In Slate, this selective blindness toward Buchanan is described thusly, quote, it's almost easier to believe Buchanan isn't saying what he seems to be saying than to recognize his views for what they are. This would appear to be the case with the Perot camp that's trying to recruit him right now, as later statements will indicate. And that's on them, because that is the one and only thing that is not on Buchanan. Perot appears to like him because he's a recognizable name who checks the reform boxes of opposing things like term limits, and apparently he's said some stuff, but he's on TV all the time, so again, he can't be that bad. It seems likely that Buchanan also appeals to Perot because the two took turns beating up on their mutual rival, George H.W., in '92. But while Perot ran against him in the general, Buchanan, then a Republican, did the unthinkable in mounting a primary challenge to a sitting president. While ultimately unsuccessful, Buchanan had identified and rallied a far-right fringe of the GOP that could be riled up with reactionary language. In '96, however, he demonstrated that he was ultimately unelectable. In a wide-open GOP primary without an incumbent, his numbers actually diminished slightly. Here in 1999, we've seen Buchanan spin the wheel a third time, and the only thing he's managed to demonstrate is that electorally, he is a dead battery. Throughout '99, George W. Bush has lorded over a crowded field in the polls. Buchanan has been reduced to a sort of human margin of error, sitting at 3% and staying there. Now, if Buchanan wasn't such a greedy little shit, he'd take this as a cue that he's innately unelectable and should exit the political stage forever. Instead, when Perot's people suggest he jump to the Reform Party, he listens. Even leaving aside his galling worldview, which appears to be shared by nobody else in this party, he's a career loser and warmed-over paleocon who everybody's sick and tired of looking at. If you want to lose, and lose badly, and sell your soul in the process, he's your man. And let's state this plainly, Buchanan is Ross Perot's man, despite the neutral appearance Perot is trying to uphold. Pat Choate was Perot's running mate in '96, and similar to Russ Verney, is in lockstep with him. Choate is also Buchanan's #1 cheerleader within the Reform Party, so he is to be believed when he reveals that Perot wants Buchanan as the nominee. And although his logic isn't elaborated on, I think I know why. I think it's because Buchanan is on TV a lot. He hosted Crossfire on CNN, he's on cable news all the time. Remember back in '92 when Perot wanted to skip conventional campaigning and just go on Larry King all the time instead? And in '96 when he campaigned exclusively from his little TV studio hidey hole? The man loves television. Perot is desperate to pick a household name who can serve as a counterbalancing figure to Ventura and prevent him from dominating the party. Buchanan's problem, of course, is that he's a household name. There is a very tight correlation between knowing Pat Buchanan and disliking Pat Buchanan, but Perot's calculus stops well before reaching this conclusion. He's a TV guy. That's all that matters. Ventura, unlike Perot, sees the existential danger of letting Buchanan into the party from a mile off. He despises every single thing Buchanan stands for, but it goes beyond even that. Ventura understands that Buchanan doesn't care about this party as it stands. He's gonna hijack it, get his grubby little mitts on its $12.6 million in guaranteed matching funds, and transform it from what's more or less a fiscally conservative, socially progressive party into a far-right blood and soil coalition that'll become invisible in the polls. If that happens, and the Reform Party can't pull 5% in the general, the matching funds disappear, and all of this irretrievably goes to shit. Many are calling on Ventura himself to run for the presidential nomination, but his loyalties lie within the state of Minnesota, not the Reform Party that hung him out to dry, and he's not going to bail in the middle of his term as governor. But he is interested in belonging to a party that's strong nationally, so he gets to work picking a horse to run against Buchanan for the nomination. Colin Powell turns him down. John McCain turns him down. Jesse Ventura takes a deep breath and picks up the phone. On the same day Pat Buchanan officially announces his presidential campaign under the Reform banner, Donald Trump officially switches his party registration from Republican to Reform. Like any good reformer, Trump claims to be a deficit hawk, and he scans as somewhat progressive on some social issues at this point in history. And like the proto-reformer himself, Jack Gargan, Trump is no stranger to taking out full-page newspaper ads. His ad advocated for the Central Park Five, all of whom were later exonerated of their charges, to be executed. But ultimately, just about everyone in this story has either a short memory or doesn't care. Ventura is no exception. Trump is listed as a billionaire and could theoretically dump as much as he wants to into a Trump presidential campaign. He has as much name recognition as anybody could hope for. Polls suggest that he could generate a strong voter base. Months before he even joined, he polled higher among reformers than everybody except Perot. And of course, it's hard not to notice Buchanan's humiliating showing in this very same poll. While Trump took nearly 18%, Buchanan stood at 2.7%, which is almost exactly where he stalled out within the GOP primary. The only reason Ventura is as low as he is here is that he has said over and over and over that he is 100% not running for president in 2000, and he's told everyone to not even try to draft him into this race. 3.4% did anyway. So here we've got a guy saying, do not nominate me under any circumstances, outperforming a guy who spent 8 years wandering across America wearing a sandwich board that says, please elect me, please God, I'm begging you. In the future, Ventura will come to see his fellow WWE Hall of Famer a lot differently, but here and now, in the purely tactical sense, Trump seems to be their best chance to save the party from a Buchanan nomination that would represent a guaranteed and eternal trip to Nowheresville. Can Trump win the presidency? Of course not, it's never going to happen, but the objectives that matter most right now are to stamp out Buchanan's pursuit of the nomination, seize control from a Perot faction that has no idea what it's doing, get the popular vote above that 5% waterline, and buy more time for Jesse Ventura to help the Reform Party build and define itself. Given that Ventura recruited him, Trump falls on the side opposite of Ross Perot by default. Crucially though, while he has officially jumped to the party, he has not yet committed to running, seemingly preferring to take a few months to wait and see how this party operates. Well, here's how. In October, Russ Verney, who's still officially the party chair until Ventura guy Jack Gargan takes over at the start of the new year, sees an opportunity to fire a salvo in Ventura's direction. Verney unsuccessfully demands Ventura's resignation from the party. This comes after a wide-ranging Playboy interview in which Ventura says the government orchestrated the JFK assassination, organized religion is a sham, and his dick works great. You can see why the Perot camp might worry about the party's optics here, but where was this concern when they recruited Buchanan, who spent years and years and years leaving a slime trail in his wake? Verney had nothing to say about any of that, and that is because, from here on out, every single move within this party, including this one, is a calculated play to seize control of it. You know, it appears the powers that be might dodge a bullet here. Just when the Reform Party seemed poised to threaten the two-party system, they have themselves become a two-party system. The very thing they hated, with these two rival factions too busy turning on each other to do anything else. The precise sort of gridlock that the party was created to oppose. It's enough to make you wonder whether we're capable of anything else. The battle lines are so clearly drawn here that Ross Perot and Jack Gargan, the two men who started this entire thing, literally haven't even spoken in years. Gargan likens the experience of being incoming party chair to, quote, riding a tiger. He's firmly within the Ventura faction, but ultimately he just wants the party to survive. He's worried, and he has good reason to be. See, Russ Verney correctly suspected that he was likely to be voted out as party chair during the convention in July, so he set a little booby trap. Before the vote, he'd managed to push through new nomination procedures that figured to blow the voting process wide open. In order to cast a vote in the party primary, you used to have to be an official Reform Party member. No longer. Now, literally anybody in America who asks for a reform ballot will get one. The stated logic here is that the nascent Reform Party needs to build a groundswell by any means necessary and let as many people into the party process as possible, but this leaves the party extremely vulnerable to a hijacking. Any big name with a sizable following can bring their voter base with them and outnumber all comers. This might not be such a concern in the case of somebody like Donald Trump, who at this point in history appears to represent the Reform Party's positions fairly accurately. But Buchanan's malevolent social politics are 1,000 miles off from those of anybody in this party, which typically either leans a little bit progressive or just stays out of social issues entirely. Gargan wants to prevent this by changing the rules and transferring nomination power to core delegates. Verney, the Perot surrogate and therefore the Buchanan guy, wants to keep those rules in place and leave the barn door open for Buchanan, which with every passing day looks like an increasingly catastrophic idea. In December, the party holds a debate featuring Pat Buchanan and a bunch of reform nobodies, and Buchanan's total inability to draw a crowd is laid bare with only 100 people showing up. One of the mics keeps falling over, the candidates are often drowned out by a Native American ceremony going on next door. One of the candidates, George Weber, sees his name has been misspelled. "We're not doing too good," he sighs. "Ross, you'd really rather have this than that, huh?" Around this time, Gargan fires a decisive shot across the bow, calling a successful vote to move the upcoming reform convention from California to Minnesota, which of course is Ventura's backyard. Verney cries foul. The two factions go to court over this. The judge says, "Geez, guys, why can't you figure this out on your own? What is wrong with you people? Go away. Leave me alone." This clears the way for the Perot-Verney-Buchanan faction to ignore the vote and move forward with planning the convention in California. Meanwhile, as the calendar flips over to 2000, they're maneuvering at the state level to select pro-Buchanan delegates to send to the convention, which suddenly makes the location a lot more important. If they hold this thing in Minnesota, that means a lot of the Ventura camp is more likely to show up since they don't need to travel. They're gonna end up holding another vote to determine the location, and everybody seems to take a beat here and acknowledge how stupid all this is. Even Verney can't help but crack a smile. This appears to be the first ever self-aware indication from anywhere in the party that maybe, just maybe, this isn't the party of reform or term limits or budget balancing, but the party of entertainment value. Later in January, there's a window of time lasting perhaps 2 or 3 minutes in which cooler heads do prevail. The two factions get together, jump on a conference call, and discuss a face-to-face meeting where they can hash out their differences. They hold themselves together for just long enough to agree to a meetup in Nashville in February before inevitably yelling and screaming over rules and regulations and hanging up on each other. Afterward, Gargan argues that they should have this meeting somewhere cheaper to get to than Nashville. This is a little tough to follow, so let's review. Right now, they're debating where they should hold the meeting, in which they'll debate where to hold the convention, in which they'll fight over which faction of the party takes control. So, yes, they are literally having an argument over where to have an argument over where to have an argument. As a consequence, potential disaster is looming. Donald Trump, seemingly the only person capable of beating back a Buchanan candidacy, has been watching all this from the sideline and indicates that if the party can't even pretend to get itself together, he's walking away. And the prospects of the former don't look too hot right now. It has become known that in this Nashville meeting, the Perot faction plans on calling a perhaps rules-violating vote over whether to vote Gargan out as party chairman, just weeks into his term after having won his election fair and square. The first tell that things aren't exactly on the level here. They've insisted on holding this meeting in Nashville, closer to Buchanan forces in Texas and Florida, further from Ventura's orbit in Minnesota, making it likely that fewer Gargan-Ventura loyalists will be able to show up to vote. Second, the person they intend to replace Gargan with is Pat Choate, the very most visibly pro-Buchanan member of the party. Choate pledges to resign his post as Buchanan's campaign co-chair upon election and remain neutral, although I don't think any of us believe that for a second. Meanwhile, do you remember back in '96 when Richard Lamb argued Perot's faction stacked the deck against him by refusing to share official party mailing lists? Nearly 4 years later, they are running back the same play. Outgoing party chair Russ Verney has refused to hand over the party's car keys, bank accounts, financials, membership lists, the things Gargan needs to operate the party, suggesting Verney and his friends never had any intention of Gargan operating it at all. Upon founding the Reform Party in '95, Ross Perot had declared that the last thing he wanted was for this to be about him. It's clear now how little he meant that. This isn't about populism. It isn't about building a viable third party. It's merely a big, huge, expensive expression of whatever a billionaire's latest whim happens to be. Anyone who sees anything more in it than that is gonna end up heartbroken.
Both Ventura and Gargan fully understand what's about to happen here. On February 11th, 2000, the day before the Nashville meeting, Ventura calls a press conference on the steps of the Minnesota State Capitol. He could hold it indoors where it isn't cold enough to see his breath, and then some, but that would be too easy.
I can't stay within a national party that could well have Pat Buchanan as its presidential nominee.
He could do what Perot, Verney, the GOP, and a sizable chunk of the media class does and simply put up with all the revolting things Buchanan stands for, but again, that would be too easy.
I can't be part of that, and I won't be part of that.
It's not just Ventura who won't be part of that. He intends to pack up the entire Minnesota Reform Party and take it with him. The party's strongest power center is going away. The party's most powerful figure, its best hope, its only member who has ever won anything, is gone. America has been watching in fascination as this profound display of self-defeat plays out right in front of us. Suppose the Perot faction does indeed win this endless feud and deliver Buchanan the nomination. What's left to win now? Who's left but a gaggle of professional election losers? What is the point? These people appear to believe there still is one. They're in Nashville, waiting to throw Jack Gargan in the trash can. The Buchanan faction has the votes to throw him out, and everybody knows it. It's a meeting that Gargan claims violates party policy, as those who called it haven't given 30 days notice. He could save himself the heartbreak and the abuse, just stay home and let him get himself voted out in absentia. But he attends anyway. February 12th, 2000. The ballroom of the Airport Marriott in Nashville, Tennessee. The historical importance of what will happen on this day and in this room is likely lost on everyone here. Decades later, it's nearly completely forgotten. It's probably why there doesn't appear to be any surviving video. It's why the few photos I've found never made it into digital news archives. The ownership status of those photos has deteriorated over the years to the point at which no one quite knows who owns them, which is why I'm not able to show them to you. But I've seen them, and I will recreate the sequence of the day's events to the best of my ability. Chairman Gargan approaches the lectern to address a congregation of approximately 140 Reform Party members. Things appear civil at first. Gargan leads the room in the Pledge of Allegiance. Then he calls for a moment of silence to honor the victims of the recent Alaska Airlines crash, which the room does indeed observe. And then, Gargan opens his mouth and begins presenting his argument that party members were not given 30 days notice, rendering this an illegal meeting, and that any effort to call a vote will be illegitimate. It's at this moment that Jack Gargan appears to fully appreciate how doomed he really is. If the forthcoming vote will be any indication, the Perot-Buchanan faction outnumbers the Gargan loyalists in the room by a count of 109 to 31. Their efforts to hold this meeting on short notice and well south of the Ohio River have paid off tremendously. A thunderous chorus of "out, out, out" reverberates throughout the ballroom, but Gargan stands his ground, shouting back, "This is an illegal meeting." This shouting continues back and forth for longer than 30 minutes. As though to shield him from their slings and arrows, a Gargan supporter jumps on stage in front of him to voice her disgust. She grabs the lectern's microphone, wrestles over it with the party vice chairman, and manages to take it for long enough to declare that this is all Ross Perot's doing, that he is no longer her hero. She's soon hauled out of the room by a security staff that's quickly finding itself unable to restore order and keep these two factions from coming to blows. The Perot sect is becoming increasingly angry that Gargan refuses to call the meeting to order. One woman, known only as Melanie of San Diego, rushes the stage in a brazen attempt to unplug his microphone. She's intercepted by Gargan ally Sue Harris DeBosch, who smacks her and shoves her to the ground. By this point, someone has called 911, and a couple of the 8 police officers summoned to the scene separate the two and escort them out of the room. Gargan continues to decry this meeting as a sham, refusing to move off the lectern even as Party Secretary Jim Manja takes the mic and tries to conduct a roll call, shouting over the shouting. Police demand that Manja step down from the podium. He tells them they'll have to throw him off. And it's at this point when police threaten to shut down the meeting altogether. Finally, Maine Party Representative Wendell Kenny gets hold of another mic and declares that if the 69-year-old Gargan doesn't cede the floor, he will be removed by force. Jack finally seems to realize that it's over. He cannot beat this back. But he doesn't leave the room. He doesn't even leave the stage. instead sequestering himself in the corner. He stays there for hours, proud, obstinate, and increasingly emotional. "You don't even know me," he cries, as the room officially begins to vote him out. He's right. They don't. Many are Buchananites who have arrived within the last few months. They likely neither know nor care that Jack Gargan is the father of this entire movement. One that began when he was as angry as they are now at him. But it wasn't just anger. It was love. Jack Gargan is one of the vanishingly few who has never been in this for himself. His full-page newspaper ads from a decade ago, the ones that started it all, began not by rattling off his innumerable grievances against the powers that be, but a declaration of love for his family, his grandchildren, as well as their grandchildren, the ones he would never meet but loved regardless. He wanted the world to be better and fairer for them than it was for him. He is a true believer, the very sort of soul who the modern American political process crushes and defeats and immiserates. There's this photo taken by a Nashville, Tennessean photographer after Gargan retreats to the corner of the stage, probably after he's been formally voted out as party chairman, but before he leaves. And his face is just buried in his hand as he wipes away tears. He's just bawling. This was the most powerful third-party movement in post-war American history. On February 12th, 2000, in Nashville, Tennessee, they killed it. It died. He watched it die. Or at least, he watched it begin to die. This will not be the last time police are summoned to a Reform Party event. This party's implosion will be even more spectacular than its creation. We're about to see how thoroughly the promise of $12.6 million can corrupt and destroy a party full of desperate fringe candidates and hangers-on. We'll witness a bum rush for that money that's unlike anything else we have ever seen in American politics in our lifetimes. It will attract the oddest coalition of American politicians ever assembled. There will be normies, there will be fascists, there will be communists, there will be candidates with political platforms so bewildering that you will not even accept them as real. Ross Perot has spent these years, unintentionally yet expertly, creating the optimal conditions for infighting, backbiting, thievery, lies, pushing, shoving, slapping, shouting, crying, cop-calling, and eventual self-annihilation that must be seen to be believed. The best chance of preventing the famously unelectable Pat Buchanan from becoming the Reform Party's presidential nominee in the 2000 election, and therefore the best chance of saving the party from potentially squandering its millions of dollars in guaranteed federal matching funds and gunning it into oblivion, now lies in Donald Trump. As of the party's Nashville meltdown in February, Trump has been a registered party member for months, but he's still taking his sweet time announcing his much-anticipated run for the nomination. Initially bullish about the prospect, going as far as to openly recruit Oprah Winfrey as his running mate, recent events have understandably given him pause. He's increasingly unsure whether he'll be able to run as a reform candidate without making a mockery of himself by association. So, Donald Trump stops for just a beat, and he takes a long look around. Let's look with him. This is what he sees. The man who opposed Jack Gargan during that Nashville debacle, taking away his mic and demanding to get the vote to oust him underway, was National Reform Party Secretary Jim Manja. Manja is a gay man and gay rights activist who allied himself with Perot in the mid-90s, believing that the Reform Party was exactly what it said on the can, a party positioned to reform the entire landscape of American politics. As such, he believed that this was a point at which gay Americans could not afford to sit on the sidelines. Manja has been described as anti-Jack Gargan, and since the battle lines are so clearly drawn, this would figure to place him in the pro-Perot, pro-Buchanan faction by default, but it's a safe bet that Manja is fundamentally at odds with Buchanan, as well as another known figure who's recently been affiliating himself with the Reform Party, a man Trump sees when he looks far to the right, David Duke. Duke is Pat Buchanan's pathetic little baby duckling waddling after Buchanan wherever he goes. If Buchanan takes 90 steps toward racism, Duke goes the full 100, thereby becoming America's most well-known racist. Apparently too racist for the KKK, he got called up to the KKKK, which I did not know existed, and became the youngest KKKK Grand Wizard in history, along the way spouting all the garbage you would expect. He actually found a way to get elected to the Louisiana House in 1989 before pretty much every prominent GOP politician slammed the door on him. As did Buchanan, who at the end of the day is still a cosmopolitan fancy lad who wants to get invited to fancy dinners. But Duke followed him around anyway, speaking of him approvingly during his runs in 92 and 96. Now he's letting it be known that he's thinking about joining the Reform Party to support Buchanan. Duke can be useful to us in that he serves as a sort of homing beacon. If you're wondering who the most racist candidate in the race is, just watch and see where David Duke goes, and you'll have your answer. So, having cast his eyes all the way to the right, Donald Trump now looks all the way to the left and finds Lenora Fulani. Dr. Fulani is among the very few characters on this stage as innately interesting as Perot, with whom she formed a strategic alliance years prior over their shared desire for a third party. Outside of that, they couldn't be much more ideologically different. Fulani is a self-described Marxist, vying to represent the interests of a voting bloc that's long been cast aside and taken for granted. She's disgusted by the Democratic Party's apparent strategy to count black voters as a given while offering them nothing in return, and as a consequence, the Dems bear the overwhelming brunt of her criticism, as they did in 92 when she earned some headlines by standing on a chair and disrupting a Clinton campaign speech. She takes a lot of flack for this, and in fact, sometimes it reads a lot like the smears we'll see applied toward a couple of notable third-party candidates in the years and decades to come. If you're attacking this major candidate from the left, well, that must mean you're an asset of the right. It's this kind of boogeyman argument that places the blame on the outsider candidate for winning those votes rather than the major, far more well-funded candidate for losing them. But hey, you know what? If you want votes, go get them. If you don't, then don't. Simple as. In 1988, Fulani became the first black woman, the first woman, and the first black candidate to secure ballot access in all 50 states as a presidential candidate, which goes a long way toward explaining why Perot wanted her on board. I should probably put my cards on the table again here. Fulani's political position on paper represents mine far more closely than that of just about anybody else's here, but this is the Reform Party, where, regardless of your political orientation, if you're looking for a hero, you're gonna need to keep looking. Fulani comes from the New Alliance Party, or NAP, which for a long time has worked to distance itself from its founder's early affiliation with the infamous Lyndon LaRouche. The NAP has also been described as cult-like, and the line between its political efforts and a closely connected network of therapy clinics, which, for one, are opposed to medical treatment for mental illness, is hazy at best and wildly unethical at worst. Fulani and the NAP's founder, Fred Newman, himself a Jewish man, have been accused of anti-Semitism, a charge Fulani categorically denies. Indeed, her sharp criticisms seem to be strictly limited to Israel, but these charges are still difficult for her to defend herself against, given her unwavering alliance with Louis Farrakhan, who regularly makes headlines that look a little something like that. Despite her clear-as-can-be mission to bolster a third-party presence in American politics, it's tough to know what exactly Lenora Fulani is really all about. And it's not about to get easier, because she is supporting Pat Buchanan. Now, as of the evening of February 12, 2000, this is how the battle lines are drawn. Over the last couple days, we've seen Jesse Ventura jump ship and movement founder Jack Gargan get thrown out. The only thing passing for an opposition right now is Donald Trump's increasingly iffy interest in challenging Buchanan for the nomination. In that sense, it's understandable for Fulani, the third party or bust pragmatist, to pick the only real coalition left. What's interesting though, is she aligned herself with Buchanan way back in September. Let's look at what was happening around this time. As a candidate, the newly arrived Buchanan was carrying about as much electricity as a drainage pipe. Meanwhile, Jesse Ventura was the live wire, the guy who clearly represented the Reform Party's best chances long term. And while Jesse Ventura was not exactly a Marxist, he was decidedly more anti-establishment than the GOP-bred Buchanan. And yet, Fulani not only sided with Buchanan, but signed on to co-chair his campaign. Why? Fulani concedes that politically they're diametrically opposed and she hates everything he stands for. Her explanation for this alliance, maybe the most bizarre alliance in the history of modern American politics, is that the name of the game is building and expanding a coalition to challenge the powers that be, no matter what that coalition looks like, no matter what that means. Fair enough, but when she says,
I don't think that Mr. Buchanan is a racist. I don't think he is an anti-Semite. If I did, I wouldn't support him. I think in many ways he's been demonized.
As demons often are, Fulani is a seasoned political vet. There is no way she doesn't know exactly what Pat Buchanan is all about. I really can't make heads or tails of this. Neither can Donald Trump, who has seemed more baffled by this party with each and every passing day. And Trump hasn't even finished surveying the room yet. He's barely started. As of now, February 12th, Buchanan and Trump are the only reform candidates seen to be plausible nominees, but they are not the only ones seeking the nomination. Not by a long shot. Those $12.6 million in matching campaign funds left by Ross Perot that are dangling from the ceiling, there is, at present, a stampede for that money. It has attracted candidates from the political far left, center, right, far right, forwards, backwards, diagonal, high, low, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. I'm sorry, I'm running out of dimensions. Every single type of candidate you can imagine is here. And before I introduce them to you, I need to emphasize that the office they are seeking is President of the United States. Lorenz Krauss, libertarian guy, won't stop quoting Ayn Rand, will run for president again in 2020, promising to abolish the presidency outright once he's elected, and split up the United States into 4 separate nations in order to protect them from Jewish people, the deep state, Rhodes Scholars, and British agents, which I guess would make him a literal Bond villain. How about that? George Weber, stock party line reform guy. Bill Pearman, stock party line reform guy who's mumbly and looks like he just rolled out of bed. Eric Thompson, staunch anti-war guy who wants America to cut the military budget in half and give up on being a superpower. Okay, this guy's pretty cool. Robert Bowman wants to institute universal health care and abolish the CIA. Alright, you're cool too. Scott Kendall, flat tax guy, boring, next. Harvey Carroll. Hold on. He's gotta go find an easel. Wait right here, okay? Sit tight. Okay, here he is. He wants judges to attend school board meetings. Wait, that's it? You need to be president for that? You had to go get an easel for that? Whatever, he's a Kentuckian. You gotta be a little bit patient with us. We mean well. William Clark, a man of such anonymity that I found one and only one very brief mention of him as a candidate who participated in one debate. Beyond that, nothing. Clark is perhaps the most invisible presidential candidate ever who is registered with a relevant political party, and as such, he deserves recognition. An added distinction, as he does not appear to have gotten any of his stated political positions on the record. He does not register an inch left or right on any matters, and is therefore, in a party claiming to be centrist and be in every single thing but, William Clark is the one and only pure centrist. Congratulations to him. Charles Collins, Florida banker who uses the royal we to refer to himself. He scans as sort of a micro-Buchanan, a fringe presidential candidate in 1996 who tried running for multiple party nominations, but never generated nearly as much publicity as he did in the mid-80s. That was when he ran a newspaper ad. Man, do reformers love newspaper ads. in protest of a number of Panama City school teachers who were planning to assign a book to their students that had the word fart in it. Not only was Collins successful in banning the book, his ad inspired numerous and explicit death threats against these teachers who bravely persevered throughout the entire miserable ordeal. Collins claimed to have gathered 9,000 signatures on a petition to ban the fart book. After a local journalist checked the validity of those signatures, she reported that the vast majority were fraudulent. This reporter was then also targeted with death threats that quickly escalated. When somebody sent her a bomb threat, going as far as to plant a fake bomb in her car, Collins dismissed it as a fun little prank. When somebody made multiple efforts to burn down her home with gasoline, Collins said, "What's the big deal? It's just an arson attempt. This way, you can get your landlord to repaint your apartment." So, as Donald Trump surveys the rank and file of this clown car they call the Reform Party, he sees a tasteful assortment of idealists, harmless weirdos, cranks, and malevolent scumbags, but wait, there's more. We must now cast our eyes to the heavens. It's at this point when my beautiful little three-dimensional political spectrum chart, which has been creaking under its own weight for a good while now, completely breaks down. Not even a third dimension will allow us to express the qualities of this final, most spectacular set of candidates. Their politics are unlike anything we are able to directly observe within three-dimensional space. These candidates exist on another plane entirely and must be plotted accordingly. First, there is His Divine Grace, Daniel Clay. Self-described prophet. Looks like he wrote a whole book full of prophecies. Should I buy it? It's $3, what the hell. Alright, bought it. Let's see what we got here. Let's crack this open. Let's hear some prophecies. Lay it on me, Danny. Computers in the future are going to be better. Well, shit. I think I just wasted $3, didn't I? He's running on a campaign of... Okay, looks like he just showed up so he could drop out. Gregory Hollister isn't actually campaigning, doesn't want to be president, has absolutely no political positions or platform, only here so he can stand on stage and preach the word of the Lord. Ken Dixon believes that the biblical end times are here and the world will soon be reduced to ash and cinder, but is such a dedicated Reform Party member that he still gives a shit about the national debt for some reason. And finally, my main man, the man with the plan himself, Dr. John Hagelin. Hagelin is a physicist with a PhD from Harvard. This is going to sound pretty normal from the outset. He advocates for renewable energy and a halt on pesticides. He does, of course, oppose PACs and soft money. He talks about gun safety, flat tax relief for low-income households. On the foreign policy front, he intends to resolve the world's ills by, as this story says, working to reduce people's tension. What does that mean? Hagelin is an acolyte of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi who developed the practice of transcendental meditation and promises to bring about world peace as soon as somebody pays him $1 billion to do so. He and others believe that through this practice one may gain access to the unified field and radiate positive energy that can influence the souls of humanity for the better and eventually become immortal. Hagelin likens skepticism of this idea to the persecution of Galileo. There is, in fact, a plan here. We're gonna save humanity, here's what we gotta do. Calculate 1% of the world's population, which right now is about 5 billion, and then find the square root of that, about 7,000. That's how many people we need to simultaneously practice transcendental meditation. If we can roust up that many and they all do it right, world peace. We're a ways off from that 7,000, it would seem. In one effort in 1986, there were only 22 takers. Crucially, acres of foam mat were rolled out to assist in this effort. You see, the problem here is that if you are completely pure of heart, if you're really, really good at meditating, you're gonna levitate and eventually start flying around. Pretty soon, you're gonna have a bunch of yogis whizzing all over the joint like deflating balloons, and they're eventually going to need a soft surface to land on. Any questions? Is everybody clear on expectations and next steps? Okay. Good. Dr. Hagelin offers us something truly special. He is the quantum candidate, occupying two spaces at once. He simultaneously inhabits this unknowable political realm and offers a coherent platform that allows him to present as a recognizable politician. Do I believe any of that unified field stuff? No, but I believe that he believes it. And I believe he genuinely wants to improve the lives of his fellow human beings. And none of this is hurting anybody. He's got his own thing going on. Good for him. And besides, it might not hurt to have an iron in the fire and the remote chance he's right about all that stuff. I mean, he did go to Harvard, right? That's not the kind of thing you want to get caught napping on. You know, I feel like a long while back we stuck a pin in something we were going to remember to bring up later. Where was it? Oh yeah. Remember when Ross Perot founded the party in 1995 and declared no weirdos allowed? I guess if you gotta make a promise like that, you're already done for, huh? Anyway, Mr. Trump, here you have it. This is the Reform Party as it exists in the year 2000. This is what an ostensible commitment to centrism and the promise of $12.6 million will get you. It's got us all jittery. Instead of hitting the centrist bullseye, nearly all of us are hitting everything but. Our darts are landing way left and way right. Some of us aren't even hitting the board, we're just turning around and chucking darts out an open window. Trump spends a number of months taking all of this in, and then he says, I'm out. You people are too weird and too racist for Donald Trump's liking. Trump is gone. Jesse Ventura is gone. Before our eyes, the Reform Party is, with startling quickness, becoming Patrick Buchanan's party. He has the green light. There's no one left to stop him. The Perot camp that recruited him had hoped he would holster his putrid and unpopular positions on social issues, run on a platform that at least somewhat represented the Reform Party brand of centrism, and ride his name recognition to a showing strong enough to let him fight another day. That is not happening. With all potential formidable opposition out of the picture, Buchanan is now free to revert to his true form. He declares that he will be the most anti-abortion candidate and that the Reform Party will be the most anti-abortion party, vowing to, quote, fight the culture of death. He counteracts Perot's previous efforts to welcome gay Americans into the party and declares that he will refuse to select a running mate who is gay, calling it a disorder and a wrong orientation. After Party Secretary Jim Manja, who himself is gay, takes offense to this, a Buchanan surrogate sends out a party-wide email effectively calling Manja trash and biological waste, stepping clearly over the line into hate speech with both feet. Buchanan naturally races to the surrogate's defense, which you could argue gives Buchanan supporters tacit permission to eventually issue Manja death threats. Buchanan and his supporters bring back a rallying cry from prior campaigns, lock and load. Although he's singularly incapable of generating broad appeal, he does have a small core supporter base he can rile up at the drop of a hat, and they love yelling lock and load at campaign rallies. This is understandably beginning to worry a lot of people throughout the party. Nothing ever comes of it, thankfully. During the California convention, however, when an old woman comes forward to voice a concern, Buchananites shout her down with a chorus of lock and load so thunderous she bursts into tears. As a direct consequence of Buchanan's ascent, the Reform Party is unraveling at the state levels. The Minnesota branch, of course, is in the process of disaffiliating, and now Wisconsin and Alabama are among a few other states that are realizing they need to decouple themselves from this. The quality that's made Buchanan most existentially dangerous to this party is his decades of experience as a hardened and unfeeling political operative. His education began in the Nixon and Reagan White Houses and continued with his multiple pursuits of the GOP nomination. He knows all the maneuvers, all the tricks, and we're seeing that now. In the spring of 2000, as George W. Bush and Al Gore are attempting to win over their own parties, get out in front of America and define their candidacies, Buchanan is instead quietly scurrying around to every low-visibility reform convention he can, not to win over the reform delegates, but to assess their loyalty. If they're not in lockstep with Buchanan, or maybe even if they are, he moves to have them thrown out and replaced with one of his own loyalists. This is a coup. It's an effective one too, and it's easy to see why. This is a party of outsiders and idealists who, from the outset, have decried politics as usual. It's worth remembering that Orson Swindle, Perot's unofficial campaign chair in '92, wore his and Perot's lack of political experience as a badge of honor. They were not ready for somebody like Pat Buchanan, who was prepared to mobilize a hostile party takeover from the jump. The only other person on this board who's been truly battle-tested is Lenora Fulani, who of course is a Buchanan supporter. Would you believe that now Ross Perot is experiencing another of his signature catastrophically timed flip-flops? That he now understands the dangers of letting Buchanan into the henhouse and realizes his error right after it's too late? Okay, it's first worth emphasizing that without a doubt, Perot pulled the strings to help secure Buchanan as the reform nominee before we now dig into a Robert Novak column that drops on February 14th, just 2 days after Buchanan forces took control of the party in Nashville. Perot's surrogate, Russ Verney, tells Novak that Perot is experiencing an acute case of buyer's remorse. Perot is now turning his back on Buchanan completely, even going so far as to daydream about the possibility of the Reform Party simply endorsing GOP candidate John McCain instead of running its own candidate. Perot is upset with Buchanan's failure to sufficiently denounce Adolf Hitler after his blowback from his recently published book. Within, he wrote that America should have never entered World War II because Hitler wasn't a threat and America could have gotten along with him. Which, of course, is nothing new. Buchanan has been saying nice things about Hitler for decades and in places where everybody could see it. It's pretty rich to hear this from Perot now. The time to experience this epiphany would have been 6 months ago, but Ross Perot, damn it, he's done it again. Just like in '92 when he allowed a completely fabricated ghost story to scare him out of the race, he's allowed himself to be suckered again. And just like in '92, he couldn't even say he was suckered by a skilled con man. Scott Barnes was a compulsive and unconvincing liar, and everybody knew it. Similarly, Pat Buchanan was no snake in the grass. There was no deception here. He was always this person. That's gonna be the legacy left by Ross Perot, the politician. A sucker. And if you won't like that framing in the years to come, well, I'm being pretty charitable here because the alternative, that he was fine with a Nazi sympathizer leading the party as long as he practiced good manners, is a lot worse. Side 1 was always the Perot side until now. Verney, being his unwavering surrogate, follows him across the line. Manja, of course, has been totally opposed to Buchanan for some time. On side 2, they find the ghosts of a lot of former allies Perot alienated who sure would be nice to have around right now. We can't even say that Perot made an ill-fated deal with the devil because the thing about deals with the devil is that the devil typically offers something you want. But as we move through June, this is what's offered. With Bush and Gore playing each other close in the polls, the third banana is now Ralph Nader, the Green Party candidate. Just 4 years ago, the Green Party was irrelevant as we expect third parties to be, accruing less than 1% of the popular vote, and less than 10% of the showing of a version of Ross Perot who was trying even less hard than usual. They were totally immaterial. But just to draw from personal experience for a moment, at this point in history, I'm in high school. I read the paper. I'm loving the stories about the Reform Party purely for the entertainment value and the photos of various weirdos pushing and shoving and yelling at each other. But at some point, reporters actually want to report on movements that are going somewhere, so I started to see more coverage of Ralph Nader and a Green Party that's significantly left of the Dems. Universal free healthcare? I've never heard that before. Raising the minimum wage? I make $6 an hour wrangling grocery carts in the Kroger parking lot. I care about that. Oh, turns out Nader was the seatbelt guy. At least this guy can say he's gone out there and done something. What has Buchanan ever done except sit around and write his dumbass books and cry like a baby about how there aren't enough white people? Fucking loser. That's how high school me sees him, that's clearly how a lot of people see him, and that is what he is. By the end of June, Buchanan is sitting at 2%, far lower than Perot ever was, even at his lowest. And wow, what do you know? It's in June that Lenora Fulani resigns from her post inside Buchanan's campaign after suddenly being troubled by the far-right leanings he's always had. She now throws her support behind the person who is now the only option left, the distant longshot who is nonetheless the only other player with a meaningful candidacy, John Hagelin. The good doctor has fiercely objected to Buchanan's ascent in recent months, both for his misanthropic positions and what he and others are terming as strong-arm politics within the party. To wit, In addition to trying to rig state conventions in his favor, it's believed that if that doesn't pay off, Buchanan is prepared to navigate some loopholes to have the primary results rescinded entirely. According to one state party official, Buchanan's been bulldozing anybody and everybody, including those who would have been receptive to him. This does seem to line up with both his brand of politics and his electoral performance. He doesn't know anything about winning people over. He clearly wouldn't know what that's like. Jesse Ventura's prediction was on the money. It would seem that Buchanan does, in fact, want to hijack this party and its matching funds to use as his personal far-right political vehicle in the future, but it's obvious to everyone except him, his staff, and his pitchfork brigade that all he's doing here is steering it into a wall. If he keeps going the way he's going, those matching funds are going away. After sitting in the backseat for decades, Buchanan finally has the car keys he's coveted his entire career, but he never learned how to drive. July 1st, 2000. I think Ross Perot was thinking about it. He was really thinking about it, just as he did in '96 upon realizing his appointed successor was a losing horse. But as a key June 30th deadline passed last night, Perot confirmed that he will not seek a third presidential run despite an enthusiastic effort within the party to draft him. The Deus Ex Machina is off the table. For the anti-Buchanan faction of the Reform Party, it's Hagelin or bust. A familiar feeling of dread drifts over the party in anticipation of its national convention to be held in Long Beach, California in August. It's shaping up to be another Nashville, complete with underhanded tactics. Buchanan is moving to install one of his own people as the head of the credentialing committee, which gives final say over who gets seated. It's just the latest signal that he is boa constricting this party, snuffing out any and every dissenting force possible. Just like the Nashville meeting, there's a conference call preceding this convention that soon devolves into a screaming match. It's unknown whether anybody looks up for long enough to notice that entering the convention, a Gallup poll now puts Buchanan at 1%, well below even Nader. This is no longer a third party, it's a fourth party, if that. All those voters who Perot and Ventura spent the 90s luring away from the Dems and GOP, well, now they're headed right back into the waiting arms of the Dems and GOP. Third-party diehards are now being absorbed by the Green Party. So that leads us to the question, who makes up this remaining unextractable tree stump, this 1% of likely voters? Surprise! The National Alliance, an explicitly neo-Nazi group, really likes the look of this Reform Party all of a sudden, with its leader pledging to get out the vote for Pat Buchanan. The secessionist, white supremacist League of the South organization also pledges fealty. The Perot loyalists still in the Reform Party who are horrified by all this now just start chucking Hail Marys. They actually managed to vote Buchanan off the Reform primary ballot, but it's not binding and can be knocked down by a 2/3 vote of the convention, in which Buchanan's people will get to decide who votes. You know, in a party that looked at least a little bit like normal, a divisive candidate seeking a party's nomination would promise to build bridges, repair wounds, unite the party. Buchanan explicitly sheds any such illusions by promising he is about to crush Hagelin and anybody else who stands in his way. August 8th in Long Beach, California. It's Tuesday. The convention doesn't officially begin until Thursday, but the fireworks begin early as we're treated to a replay of the Nashville debacle that often follows it beat for beat. There's a disagreement about rules and regulations and various minutiae again that leads to pushing and shoving and shouting again. A Reform Party official yells, "This is illegal," which Jack Gargan yelled in Nashville verbatim. Police are called again. A Reform Party official dares police to arrest him again. Ross Perot is nowhere to be seen again. By this point, the father of the party has fallen so far off the map that he didn't even respond to an invite. But his top surrogate, Russ Verney, is here, and he's leading an anti-Buchanan rebellion on the fly with party secretary Jim Manja. Today, and in the days to follow, Manja will spend a whole lot of time looking intensely annoyed, pointing, yelling, and pointing while also yelling. If Michelangelo had painted the story of the Reform Party in the Sistine Chapel, this one would be on the ceiling somewhere. Manja, both thumbs proudly down in protest of some undoubtedly boring little procedural thing that's been lost to history, is upstaging his fellow senior party official and blocking him from speaking into the mic. That official is the recently promoted interim Reform Party chairman, the absolutely perfectly named Jerry Moan. Moan was the prototypical early Ross Perot supporter, a Vietnam War vet and MIA activist determined to bring the major parties to heel. He became Perot's longtime point man in Long Island, and at one point through the party's endorsement to Tom Galata, a powerful Republican politician there, and a pretty significant extension of the olive branch. Moan made sure they celebrated Galata, even getting the whole party together to hold a brunch in his honor. Galata told Moan, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll be there," and then completely flaked on him, leaving poor Jerry to vamp and fill time for 4 excruciating hours. At some point, he just started individually saying hello to every single person who was there. But Jerry Moan is used to this. He's the high school chemistry teacher who knows he's unrespected, resented, even hated, and is fine with that because at some point it will be 2:30 and he can go home. When he allegedly ignores a party rule, thereby allowing Buchananites to storm the nomination vote, multiple people, including Manja, compare him to Hitler. But Jerry's not Hitler, he's just a guy trying to do his job. In a party ostensibly all about centrism, he's the only one determined to hold the center. Now, I'm sure Manja would tell you that when up against a threat as existential as Pat Buchanan, a stone-cold political operator who's been spending all year poking away at Reform Party rules and procedures like it's a Jenga tower, the party, including its chairman, has no choice but to stand in clear opposition. Manja might be right about that. In fact, I think he is right. But if Jerry is thought to be a Buchananite, he's misunderstood. I would call him Pontius Pilate, except that would necessitate a Christ figure, and there are none of those within 1,000 miles of here. Instead, he's simply a pragmatist, one who seems to have read ahead and knows how this is gonna end. Early this year, Jerry openly predicted that on its present course, the Reform Party was headed for destruction, but had little interest in trying to change that course. Later, he speculated that the Reform Party would go down in history as a niche operation that, at best, will give American voters a little something to think about on their way to eventual ruin. He's the only one within the party who's been talking like this. He seems to know that it doesn't really matter whether Buchanan or Hagelin or anybody else wins this nomination. He's fully reckoned with the fact that all of this is toast. So why is he still here? Why bother? Well, he loves this party every bit as much as Manja does, but rather than trying to beat back the oncoming hordes, he seems content to simply carry out the duties of his office faithfully and impartially with the dignity it deserves. He's determined to run this party as it always should have been run. If the party can't survive a few days of being run like the big kids do it, it was all for nothing anyway. Interim Chairman Moan rules that anyone in the room, regardless of who they are or what their party registration is, can vote on who will be seated at the convention, which everyone knows tips the scales fully in Buchanan's favor. Perot surrogate Russ Verney tries to push and shove his way into the room, but security throws him out. Pat Buchanan's campaign now declares victory. He is now the presumptive nominee of the Reform Party. Or at least one of the Reform parties. Coordinating over walkie-talkies, Jim Manja and Russ Verney round up all the John Hagelin supporters, stage a walkout, and march next door, where they will throw their own convention. There are now 2 Reform parties, with 2 conventions on the same street. One will nominate Buchanan, one will nominate Hagelin, and both will go to the Federal Election Commission and argue that they are the real Reform Party and they should receive the $12.6 million in matching funds. So we're left with 2 simultaneous conventions held by 2 Reform parties who hate each other. What does that look like? Well, let's watch a little C-SPAN. First, scenes from the Buchanan Reform Convention, the one people had actually been planning and setting aside money for. It shows. They got a nice big done-up stage. They even have their own band, playing the exact sort of shit you would imagine Pat Buchanan likes to listen to. Among the first speakers is filmmaker Joe Strite, who recently made a documentary about the ascent of the Reform Party. She was gracious enough to agree to speak here, but I want to clarify that she is not affiliated with the Buchanan Reform Party, and you probably could have figured that out for yourself since she comes off as a nice person with interesting things to say.
It was a great story, and it was an opportunity to take a journey through American democracy.
Oh no, she called America a democracy instead of a republic. This is going to expose her to the most annoying, well, actually, American politics has to offer. You know, amongst all the bigotry and Machiavellian takeover tactics, one quality of this Buchananite faction that gets lost is how unbelievably annoying they are. If it's not the most annoying political faction in American history, it's close. I need a break, so let's see how things are going over at the Hagelin Convention, where John Hagelin himself is speaking right now. Earlier I called him the quantum candidate, and now you are about to get the full experience. Here he is on education. You know that old yarn about how humans only utilize 5 or 10% of their intellectual potential, which is known to be complete ascientific bullshit?
5% of the innate potential of the brain is not enough.
Well, he gives us that, which is unsurprising coming from the guy who believes we can meditate ourselves to immortality. But he also gives us this, and for obvious reasons, I'd like to remind you that we are now in the year 2000.
If we want to bolster our national security, number one, stop creating enemies throughout the world.
We've heard this logic from others, and we still hear it in our time, that the reason we should stop prosecuting wars, fomenting coups of democratically elected leaders around the world, the list goes on, is that it will make us safer. Sure, but I always felt something very important was missing from that calculus. And this, moments later, is what separates Hagelin from every other candidate of the 21st century I can recall whose name has been printed on a presidential ballot.
We have become the principal target of terrorism on Earth, not because we stand for freedom, but because our government continues to do hateful things to other nations in the name of the American people, and that will stop.
America should abandon its present foreign policy, Hagelin says, not simply because it compromises our national security, or because it's expensive, or because it's wasteful, or because it's merely an inadvisable move on a chessboard, but because it is immoral and hateful and wrong. It's an anti-war positioning that stands out as starkly as Jesse Ventura's did. You're not likely to hear this from a candidate from the two major parties, because doing so would incriminate the parties and donors funding them. This is the promise of a party like Reform. They're at total liberty to assess things as they are, not as they're meant to be seen. Now, this complete absence of a playpen also means that all their other silly ideas, for instance Hagelin's Professor X stuff, can run wild. And once American voters look past Hagelin's generally likable affect, which is roughly 2 parts Michael McKean and 1 part John Malkovich, and take stock of those ideas, he's unelectable. He's probably not even approaching 5% matching funds territory. President John Hagelin is not possible, but he presents what is possible, what could be, and what, this time at least, will not be. Speaking of, let's walk back next door to the Buchanan Reform Convention, where around this same time, Jerry Moan is at the podium trying to get everybody seated and start the proceedings. He wants to reference this line, "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread." It's a good line. Not really sure why he wants to use it here, but he's gonna try to rework it into some sort of announcement that it is time to be seated. Knock 'em dead, Jerry.
Angels may rush in, but don't fear to tread into your seat.
God damn it, Jerry. On day 3 of the Buchanan Reform Convention, Pat Buchanan is officially introduced as the nominee. Earlier in the day, Jerry presides over a smorgasbord of various speakers and housekeeping items. The words "point of order" are repeated 20 billion times, and of course, you can't hold a Reform Party event without some kind of equipment malfunction. Remember a few months back when a Reform Party debate was continually interrupted when the mic stand kept falling over? I've dug up so many times that's happened with the Reform Party. It's some meeting or campaign stop or whatever. A banner will fall off the ceiling, signs tear themselves off the wall, mics fall over, you name it. Not even the party's inanimate objects can keep themselves together. So it's with this knowledge that we take in this question directed to Chairman Moan.
Is there a motion to close? Yes, sir.
Oh man, look at that eye roll. I have no idea who this guy is, but Jerry sure seems to.
My name is Eric Owens from the 26th Congressional District, and I want to...
Dude, just hold the mic. Just put down the sign. You don't need the Buchanan sign. Everybody in this room is already in the tank for Buchanan. Just chill out. Just put down the sign. Take the mic. Hold on to the mic. Hold on to the mic.
Okay.
Soon after, another Reform Party member comes forward, takes the floor mic.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
John Ayala, San Gabriel, California.
And delivers a speech for the ages.
Are you a delegate, sir?
No, I'm not.
Sorry, sir, I can't allow you to speak.
Thank you, sir.
If If that doesn't make you proud to be an American, you ought to check your pulse. All this gives you a taste of what the life of party chairman has been like for Jerry. All the egos and factions and cults of personality have been far, far bigger than he could ever be. Upon stepping into the role in May, he freely admitted he'd be a figurehead, a passive entity at the whim of whichever waves come rolling through. All he can do is ensure changes come about in an orderly manner. He's powerless to stop anything, including this. Jerry Moan was hoping he could avoid one particularly painful piece of business before concluding the early session.
One other item, sir.
I'm sorry. Time out. I tried to get to lunch.
He cannot.
I move that we recall the National Secretary.
I second that motion.
No, everybody, time out.
Several Buchanan reformers jump in line to second the motion to oust Jim Manja as party secretary. Jerry cannot stop this.
Mr. Manja has been a long-standing member of this party.
Throwing Manja out of the party is a formality at this point, as he's already chosen his side, but...
And he has chosen his will.
These two go back.
But we will be respectful.
Jerry and Jim were allies once, maybe even friends. They both joined the movement in the early 90s, before the Reform Party was even founded, when the promise of Ross Perot and all he stood for seemed greater than ever. Maybe Jerry is thinking back on those times. Maybe he's reflecting on the homophobia some of those very people in this room have lobbed in Manja's direction. Maybe there's a difference between knowing all this will fall apart and watching it fall apart in front of him.
That's been seconded.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McLaughlin, Mr. Vice Chairman, would you take the microphone?
He can't be part of this. He can't do it. Other things will happen on this stage today. Buchanan will accept the nomination and live out his pathetic little fantasy. Confetti will drop, pyrotechnics will shoot from the rafters. None of it will matter. Within the Buchanan faction, at least, the question of whether or not any of this should be taken even the least bit seriously is definitively answered by the introduction of Izola Foster, Buchanan's choice for vice presidential nominee. This campaign season she'll say, quote, "I think they're the most wonderful group of people I've ever met. The they there is the super duper far right group, the John Birch Society." Foster has been politically active for some time. On multiple occasions, she's come to the defense of the police officers who beat Rodney King, saying they acted in the line of duty, and going so far as to throw a benefit in honor of one of the cops who was sentenced to prison, describing him as, quote, "a political prisoner." Foster was a longtime high school teacher who's very outspokenly opposed to free school lunch with a strange level of intensity. She was staunchly opposed to providing public education for illegal immigrants, which, due to the makeup of her student body, made her vastly unpopular. She was eventually chased off by a roving gang of Maoists, a tale as old as time, and joined Buchanan's GOP primary campaign in 1996. There are, of course, people from every kind of background and ethnicity who can and do sit in pretty much every single slice of the political spectrum. Still, the press is understandably intrigued by a black woman who's running with a guy who has, to take just one example, endorsed the belief that white people are genetically superior. During her introductory press conference, when she's asked about the role race will play in her campaign, Foster says,
"There's only one race that we're interested in, and that's the race to the White House."
And if you're wondering whether there's any more to it than that, I can confirm there's really not. I did the due diligence of buying and reading her entire book. None of it will make it in here because, frankly, there's nothing really very meritable in it except for this. I got an autograph copy. Look at that. Now, look at how she signs her name. Izola Foster. That's pretty cool, right? You can't say that isn't cool. Anyway, Buchanan and Foster are the Reform Party nominees, although whether it's the Reform Party is up for debate. Immediately after the convention, the Hagelin sect files a complaint with the Federal Election Commission arguing that they should be the ones to receive those millions of dollars in matching funds. A lot of it comes down to whether he can get his name on ballots, and Hagelin's argument is that he's able to do so via the Natural Law Party ticket he ran on in '96. It's not a great argument. Meanwhile, the Hate Talk Express keeps on rolling. Buchanan gives a speech at Bob Jones University, which has drawn fire recently due to its institutional opposition to interracial dating. Buchanan is offended, not by that, but by all the criticism the university has taken as a result. He is here for that purpose, to let everybody know, for the 10,000th time, which side he is on. Historically, he's gotten away with this stuff by talking out of both sides of his mouth, which, again, I would argue is not skilled deception. It doesn't let Perot off the hook for initially supporting him or CNN for putting him on air. Buchanan simply spills out his bile, then says the magic words that give people permission to look the other way. Example, after the convention, Buchanan proclaims that bigots have no place in his party, before immediately hopping right back on his hobby horse and telling gay people they are avatars of American destruction. That proclamation, though, is a problem for Buchanan. He's alienating the various white nationalist and white supremacist groups who make up so much of his voter and volunteer base, with a lot of them feeling like he's turned his back on him. After temporarily soaring in the polls to the majestic heights of 4%, he makes himself at home in the 1% range. This while stating that his primary objective, his only hope, is to rise to 15% in the polls so that he qualifies to participate in debates with Bush and Gore. Which will not happen, but even if it did, it would present a whole new batch of problems for Buchanan, because the more Americans have to look at him and hear him talk, the more they dislike him. His unfavorability ratings are through the roof. It's incredible, really. Probably historic. Late in September, 61% of those polled by the Hackensack Record in New Jersey register an unfavorable opinion of Buchanan. That they ran this poll in a traditionally blue state doesn't make these numbers any less horrifying for Buchanan. A favorable rating in the low teens is something you typically only see when people are polled on, say, Congress as a whole. Never an individual politician, and definitely never a candidate who's never even held elected office before. He doesn't even get the outsider bump that third-party candidates typically do, which Nader demonstrates well here. There are lots of likely voters who have no intention of actually voting for Nader, but they at least like the idea of him. Not so with Buchanan, who holds near universal name recognition. Everybody knows him, and everybody hates him. Staring electoral humiliation dead in the face, and still unable to access those $12.6 million in federal matching funds while Hagelin's case works its way through the FEC, Buchanan calls out into the darkness for Ross Perot, begging for the party's founder, who once welcomed him and later moved against him, to now save him. And Ross takes us all by surprise. He does emerge from the shadows, ending a complete self-imposed exile that has lasted longer than a year. But he isn't here to help Buchanan. Instead, Perot submits an affidavit to the FEC arguing that he, the candidate who earned all those matching funds in the first place, believes John Hagelin and Jim Manja are the rightful owners of those funds. The only game left for anyone to play here is to somehow claw to 5% in the popular vote to keep the lights on in 2004. And although Hagelin is such a long shot that he isn't included in polls, there are at least unknowns here. He's a nice-seeming man who can eloquently communicate the reform platform. Give him some money to work with, and who knows? Buchanan's ceiling, on the other hand, is painfully obvious. He's not getting there. Perot's affidavit is a devastating rebuke of Buchanan and an unambiguous admission that Ross Perot deeply and truly screwed up in recruiting him in the first place. But it's not enough. The FEC rules that the money will go to Buchanan. They might as well wheel it out to the backyard and burn it. I don't think he'd make it to 5% if they gave him 10 times this much, because ultimately you're not allowed to hire people to vote for you. With this money, he buys an expansive and defeatist run of radio ads pleading voters to cast their lot with him just for the sake of having a third party. His campaign also produces and runs the infamous anti-immigration meatball ad. Within, a man chokes on his meatball, calls 911, sits through an automated menu in which he's asked to select Spanish, Korean, Swedish, or Swahili, and dies, never having reached the English option. A reporter asked Buchanan what this guy, who clearly couldn't speak, would have done even if he did get English. Ah yeah, whoops. Guess he still would have died, huh? So, How do you poll if just about nobody can stand you to begin with, and then you run a TV ad, and since the premise of the ad is inherently nonsensical, you're really just airing a 30-second TV show where somebody dies for no reason? Well, you're cast into the dreaded less than 1% domain. These polls typically survey around 800 likely voters, which would mean that more than 0 but fewer than 8 people answered Buchanan. The flu would poll better than this. I think one of the most important lessons life has to teach us is to take our laughs where we can get them, so let's get them here. It is not only deeply satisfying, but incredibly funny to watch this well-moneyed loser shit his pants in full view of the entire nation, made more so by the knowledge that he wants to be president worse than anyone has ever wanted to be president. He wants it so bad. Remember when Perot quit the 92 race and still polled at 16% a full 2 months later despite not actually even being a candidate? These days, Buchanan is pointing to his recent gallbladder surgery as a reason why his momentum is stalled. But remember in 96 when Perot completely mailed it in, pretty much refused to go outside, and got 8 million people to vote for him anyway? Yeah, this right here is the good stuff. Buchanan would do anything to get votes, he just doesn't know how. Look at this, now he's denouncing tobacco lawsuits as shakedowns. I don't think he's getting paid to do this, which I believe would make him the only person in America dumb enough to defend big tobacco for free. Meanwhile, Azola Foster is making a campaign stop to defend the Confederate flag and meet with a guy who says slavery was actually good. They're just flailing. He's adrift. He's sitting in his home in McLean, Virginia, talking to his cat, telling him that one day he'll have a Secret Service detail, musing that lots of people out there wish he was dead. An idea that Pat Buchanan, being Pat Buchanan, takes solace in. In fact, there's a lot of loneliness going around. On the same day, just a few miles away from Buchanan, Hagelin is speaking with one of the few journalists who will give him the time of day. He's still in the race, running under the natural law banner he's reusing from 96, and at the moment he's trying to explain to this poor journalist how natural law works exactly. You see, it's like a pen. You know how you drop a pen and it falls on the ground? It's like that. You get it? No? Just two ships sinking in the night. Around this time, the loneliness is felt by Jesse Ventura as well. He's still governing the state of Minnesota, but he's having the hardest time getting anything passed, getting anything done. He's the only independent, and can't seem to make friends with anybody on either side of the aisle. It's perhaps a window into what things might have been like had the Perot pipe dream ever come to pass. Okay, they win the presidency. Now what? All the same, Ventura is probably happy to be so clearly proven right about Buchanan. In fact, he goes as far as to speculate that this is all happening according to plan, that someone, perhaps the GOP, sent Buchanan to infiltrate the Reform Party, take it over, and steer it off a cliff. There's no real evidence supporting this theory beyond the observation that Buchanan is running what is far and away the worst well-funded presidential campaign America has ever seen. Given how desperately Buchanan continues to labor over the final days, if that is indeed his purpose, it's clear nobody told him, and that simply being himself is doing the job just fine. Even for Ross Perot, life these days is not at all like he imagined. This is a man who once considered George H.W. Bush his mortal enemy. Some kind of old Texas beef, probably. Although he didn't typically single out and attack his opponents in the campaigns, Perot did really seem to relish the idea of sticking it to Bush and enjoy the narrative that he'd cost him a second term. And yet, on the Thursday before Election Day, Perot does the unthinkable. He endorses Bush's son. This is Ross Perot's final, unmistakable goodbye to the Reform Party he founded. He will never appear at a Reform meeting or convention again. He won't affiliate himself with them. He won't speak to them. He won't speak about them. It's over. Well, we're losing main characters with each passing day. Nothing left to do but check in on what old fucknuts is up to. The next day, a truly astonishing poll is published. It's among a set of polls, each of which ask, per usual, whether likely voters intend to vote for Bush, Gore, Nader, or Buchanan. A lot of battleground state poll results indicate that Buchanan can claim no meaningful strongholds and is flatlining everywhere. The Pennsylvania poll doesn't even include a percentage for him, but does at least acknowledge he exists, which I guess is something. The Newsweek national poll doesn't even list him at all, perhaps just burying his total within the unprinted 7% margin of also-rans here. In most other national polls, he's locked in at 1 point, but in the Gallup poll, the most recognized poll and the one I prefer to use whenever it's been available, Buchanan does not register. The sample size is far larger than that of any other poll here, more than 2,000 likely voters. Maybe Buchanan's showing was too small to print? The same Gallup poll results published by another paper offer clarity, 0%. Well, still, maybe Buchanan's showing was less than 1 point and they rounded down? Doesn't seem so. This earlier poll makes it clear that if you register a non-zero number that's less than 1, Gallup will say so and put you down for a fraction. So, as far as I can figure, it would seem as though exactly 0 of the 2,128 likely voters surveyed answered Buchanan. A flat 0. For the standard bearer of a political party that in the last election never polled below 5%, even at its worst. For a household name known to virtually everyone whose campaign has had $12 million to spend over the last 6 weeks, 0 likely voters. This is incomprehensible. A party that has survived so much could not survive him. He has destroyed the only third party capable of wielding influence at the national level, the only serious challenge of the two-party system of the last century. And although he relied on plenty of help from those who propped the door open for him, he did it all by himself. The day this poll drops, he's in Hartford, Connecticut, speaking to a room the paper charitably describes as sparsely attended, but they print a photo. There's literally 1 person in attendance. And by the way, yes, another sign does fall down. He spends some of the day walking around town. I'm sure people recognize him, but no one wants to talk to him, save for one supporter who still says he is not voting for him. Pat Buchanan is still stumbling through 16-hour days of relentless campaigning, traveling, eating crappy airport food, losing sleep, in so doing adding the pitch-perfect finishing touches of the most humiliating defeat in the history of American presidential politics. He clings to his one and only source of consolation, his tiny, puttering, 2-stroke imagination in which he dreams that one day after he's dead he'll be vindicated and everybody will realize he was right all along. In the 2000 United States presidential election, Al Gore wins the popular vote with nearly 51 million. George W. Bush, despite falling about 500,000 short of that figure, is ruled to have won the electoral vote and therefore becomes the 43rd president of the United States. Ralph Nader, despite polling at 5% near the end, wins about 2.7% and therefore does not secure matching funds for the Green Party in 2004. John Hagelin, running under the Natural Law banner, receives a little more than 80,000 votes nationwide. Patrick Buchanan finishes with 448,895 votes. This, of course, makes the Reform Party ineligible for those matching funds, which they will never receive again. It is probably technically accurate to say that Pat Buchanan spoiled the election of George W. Bush, but only strictly technically. It's easy to see why so many Palm Beach County voters might have accidentally voted for the wrong guy. You see the second guy, you assume you're supposed to punch the second hole. That hole actually belonged to Pat Buchanan, who received an extraordinary bump in this county as a result. It just as easily could have been any other candidate in that slot and things would have turned out the exact same way. If, for example, Ralph Nader were in that slot and he saw a bump, it wouldn't raise so many red flags. What's special about Buchanan being here, though, is that it builds a very strong case that these votes were indeed accidental. This was a man who just won 0.3% of the vote in Florida statewide, and yet he won an otherwise unexplainable 0.8%, more than double that, in a county with a high representation of Jewish people and people of color, who Buchanan had spent decades working overtime to alienate. I mean, come on, you're telling me that 1 in 125 people would actually vote for this guy? Get serious, that is beyond the realm of possibility. Even Buchanan himself admitted this much, that those votes should not have been his. So while Buchanan did not impact any outcome, his supreme, unparalleled unelectability really put a bow on it. Here he won well over 1,000 more votes than he had any business winning, the vast majority of which were surely cast by people trying to vote for Gore. Just 600 or so more votes for Gore would have won him Florida, and therefore the presidency. This was the Reform Party's final moment of national relevance, however incidental. When Jack Gargan ran for Tampa City Council in 1974, he spent 40 cents and won 1,600 votes. In other words, 1,000 votes cost him 25 cents. We'll do our due diligence here and account for inflation. 25 cents in 1974 accounted for 91 cents in 2000. Gargan didn't win, but it was a respectable showing and the definition of efficiency. This was a powerful expression of his determination to get big money out of politics, but it was also a reflection of how electable he was, how likable he was, how strongly his message really resonated with people. Not counting any other funding, strictly the $12.6 million of federal matching funds, 1,000 votes cost Pat Buchanan approximately $28,000. "24 years later, the Reform Party is still here. A lot of their website still looks like something you might have seen on the internet in the year 2000, and I mean that as a compliment. It's nice, simple, straightforward, the qualities reformers have always hoped to see in their party. They do still put forward presidential candidates, although in that department they've settled firmly into the middle of the pack of fourth parties who never even scratch the paint of the Dems or GOP. Some of their members hold elected office in small towns and villages, mostly within the state of New York. Recently, the Reform Party finally excised the last remaining far-right Buchananite elements from their party, patching up the legal framework that had allowed them entry. This took them 20 entire years, which is remarkable because Buchanan himself immediately bailed on the party he had insisted on conquering. He did begrudgingly make an appearance at the next summer's convention in 2001, dipping in and out within a half hour's time. A reporter managed to flag him down while he was speed-walking out of there and asked him for any words of wisdom he'd like to offer the Reform Party. Well, they should keep working at it, he said. They never saw Pat Buchanan again. His legacy persisted, though, even if few of us recognized where exactly it came from. Let's look back to that press conference in which he announced Foster as his VP.
And cleaning up what I think is the dismal swamp of American politics, draining that swamp.
Sound familiar? Donald Trump didn't necessarily drain the swamp straight from Buchanan. Several other politicians have used that line. It's just one of many similarities that abound. The nationalism that was always laid on thick, the fear-mongering over immigration, the strong-arm tactics, the rallying of angry townsfolk that helped him take over a listless political party. So much of it was there. Although it doesn't seem likely that Trump drew direct inspiration from his one-time Reform Party rival, it has been suggested, as Politico did in 2017, that Buchanan's runs in 92 and 96 softened up the GOP for Trump's eventual arrival. But having just relived his 2000 Reform performance, it's pretty tough to believe he ever accomplished anything at all. So what was the difference between Buchanan's government-funded road trip and a Trump campaign that won 62 million votes? Well, the latter belonged to a major party, was an entertainer, had way more money to spend, the list goes on, but one significant reason, I think, was that Trump appealed to the self above everything else. You have been wronged. What you want matters. You are the superstar. America doesn't belong to everybody who lives here, it belongs to you. Buchanan instead tried to anchor his resentment politics to some broader shared idea of righteousness and moral good. He didn't play the game this constituency wants you to play. They say they read the good book, but in large part they very obviously do not. If you're gonna stand for those things, you can wave the Bible around all you want, but the unspoken deal is that you sure as hell had better not open it. It all makes sense. This 99 variable equation balances perfectly. That's the wildest thing about it. All of this, every single bizarre twist and turn of this, makes sense and was more or less inevitable. Buchanan successfully hijacked the party because he was able to find loopholes in party rules because they were so loosely constructed, because Ross Perot hated doing all the boring stuff that is demanded by the realities of American politics. Buchanan was there in the first place because Perot was desperate to keep Jesse Ventura in check, because Ventura's emergence as a party superstar was threatening Perot's ego, because Ventura, unlike Perot, actually won an election, which was a victory Perot couldn't claim any part of, because the billionaire Perot wouldn't even throw Ventura a few $1,000 as a goodwill gesture, because Ventura belonged to a state party that had previously dared to vote against Perot, because Perot had been accused of rigging the party in his favor, because Perot liked to brush the rules aside once they became inconvenient, because at the end of all of it, Perot could never seem to decide whether all this was about his duty to America in quest to resolve its ills, or just his chance to live out his own TV show and talk shit and have a good time. All of this was made possible by the initial ascent of Perot, who packaged the grievances of Jack Gargan and his disgruntled mail-in masses into something that was far more entertaining, compelling, and seemingly genuine than anything the Dems or GOP had to offer. Perot, while not single-handedly capable of achieving escape velocity, initiated the ignition sequence with precisely the right fuel at precisely the optimal point in history. In 1992, living in America did not necessarily feel good if you were, for instance, an Appalachian community being wrecked by public health crises, or one of many black Americans seeing their families and communities torn apart by the war on drugs and a barbarous legal system. But the popular idea among the upper middle class, the professional class, the media class, the people most likely to, say, vote, was that as of 1992, America had won. We just won the Cold War, we just won the Gulf War, terrorism and school shootings were still out in the offing. This was the year Francis Fukuyama published his book The End of History and the Last Man, in which he explicitly put words to a sort of ambient hunch that had been floating around in the ether. That since fascism and communism had now both been defeated, American democracy represented the final and ideal form of human government. Game over. We won. So if that's the way you feel about it, what do you do next? Well, you knock out some chores. Clean up the garage, fix the gutters, balance the federal budget. If you weren't around for the early to mid-90s, would you believe that the federal deficit was all anyone ever talked about? Even as a 9-year-old, I heard about it all the time despite not knowing or caring about it at all. It's gotta be pretty funny for you to look back on a time when that issue won a guy 20 million votes. It was the optimal time and place for Ross Perot and his message. He was the Stage 1 rocket, but the thing about being a Stage 1 rocket is that you don't get to go to the moon. Once you've done your job and reached a certain elevation, they are gonna have to cut you loose. The second stage rocket, which can navigate more precisely and has a lot less to carry, will take over from there. There's just no point in you sticking around anymore. You'll do all harm and no good, you're dead weight. But Ross insisted on keeping himself attached, even after stepping away as the party's front-facing ambassador. He kept on meddling, kept on sowing confusion and division. As a direct consequence, neither he nor they ever entered orbit. And that didn't have to mean winning the presidency. It could have meant remaining strong enough to force concessions from the major parties, or winning House or Senate elections, or putting council members in office in major cities. None of that happened. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. We could all go on for quite a while, retracing all the things we think they should have done differently. I can give it a try. First, I'm not sure a fiscally centrist platform could capture people's imaginations for the long haul, especially if they're institutionally neutral on social issues and don't highly prioritize civil rights or gay rights or women's rights. On the organizational front, as painful as it is to admit, they really did need to start doing it like the big kids do it and bring in seasoned lawyers and political vets. Political historians often lament the Reform Party's tunnel vision, suggesting that they were looking at things upside down and spent way too much money and energy on unrealistic presidential runs. While doing so did pay big dividends for them at the outset, I think they would have been better off using that momentum to regroup and party build at the state and local levels. In so doing, they hopefully would have broadened and diversified their support base just a little bit. Buchananites aside, it's not as though they all intentionally set out to build a constituency that, if the deluge of press photos are any indication, was almost exclusively white. But it really came back to bite Ross the day he realized that what he thought was America was actually just the part of America that looked like him. I mean, past a certain point, if you are not at least trying to expand your coalition in this way, you should probably limit your political ambitions to, I don't know, repaving the feeder road outside your subdivision. Now, even if they had done all these things, and done them well, and avoided all these pitfalls, who's to say what they would have amounted to? Maybe there always was a shelf life for this movement, and it would have faded from view in a much more gradual, much less entertaining manner. But it does make you wonder, doesn't it? Not about this independent movement, but the next one. This is coincidental, but compelling nonetheless. Our world began right after the Reform Party's world ended. The near quarter century since has been defined by a protracted, relatively quiet unwinding of ideas of justice and fairness and things operating like they're supposed to, punctuated by catastrophic events so fundamental to our history that they claim entire years. We only need to see the 4 digits. We can paint the rest of the picture from there. Some were acts of God, at least in part, but while most developed nations would have adequately invested and mobilized to contain the destruction, we learned that our leaders were too inept, negligent, and ultimately indifferent to do the same. Others were entirely man-made, soup to nuts, and when the men who made them saw zero consequences, we were reminded that the leaders you put in office are in service of them, not you. These definitional events have taken very different forms, but they all share 2 signature qualities. First, they're all not only avoidable in part or in whole, but in many cases actively, infuriatingly, horrifyingly opted into. Second, it is both major parties who are responsible for them. Sometimes they more or less take turns, other times they join forces in equal measure. There's a world in which both these parties would suffer defections on a massive scale as a consequence, but our votes are often informed not by what we want, not by what we believe in, but by what appears to be less dangerous. It's hard to blame us for retreating to that calculus because the alternatives become more immiserating with each passing year. But what it means is that the onus has shifted. It's no longer their responsibility to win you over, which is, I swear to God, the way it once was to a considerable extent. No, the responsibility is yours to get in line, and if you don't, and if they fall short, especially by a small margin, it's not their fault for failing to sufficiently reflect the people's will and fight for the things that most need fighting for. It is your fault for everything that comes after. Interestingly, you tend to catch a lot more flack if you vote third party than if you don't vote at all, despite it making no mathematical difference. Those who voted for Nader in 2000 heard it, those who voted for Jill Stein in 2016 heard it. Your selfishness, your juvenile impulses, your nihilistic drive to throw away your vote is what has doomed us all. So, you voted for us last time and were left out in the cold? Well, you need to vote for us a second time. You voted for us 3, 4, 5 times, and you're fed up with being ignored? You have no right to be fed up. Do the math and fall in line. We are the only chance you've got. Hold your nose and walk in there and pull the curtain and punch the hole and shut the fuck up. And you know what the most intolerable, unbearable part of that is? It's the nagging, unrelenting idea that they might be right. That the best possible world really is the second worst. Others will make an argument that's similar, only much more reasonable and empathetic. Look, they're terrible, you know it and I know it, but the only realistic way to affect change is to identify your party of choice and work within that party to push it where it needs to be. It's a pretty grim thing of them to ask of you to look back at the party who's kicked you around for 20 years and then resolve to give them 20 more, but who knows? Maybe they're right too. Something tells me that you are not exactly looking to me for guidance here, which is smart on your part, because while I personally have my hunches, it's neither my strong suit nor my business to prescribe any particular way forward. I'm just a guy who reads the paper, nothing more than that. At the risk of condescending or giving you permission for something you did not ask permission for, there is one and only one argument I will allow myself to make with full and absolute confidence. You are not wrong to consider a third option. You're not wrong to think about it, to talk about it, to want it, to vote for it, to advocate for it, to help organize it. You are allowed to have this. This is idealism. It might be juvenile, it might be strategically unsound, and on this spoke of the wheel at least, it's probably likely to fail by at least some measure. If it ever does succeed, it might be so far down the wheel you will never see it. But it's all yours. This is the gift the Reform Party has given us. Their politics might not look at all like yours. They might have presented shortcomings that you yourself do not suffer from. But these goofballs allow us to look back on a time not all that long ago, within most of our lifetimes, and do away with the illusion that it is not possible. They allow us to imagine it. That is their legacy. If this were to become a way forward, we might answer the most interesting question. Who is this? Who is this? Who exactly are we looking at right now? This sometimes lovable, often frustrating, sometimes insufferable gaggle of eccentrics and weirdos and misfits. Is this a funny mirror reflection, a caricature of ourselves? Or is it ourselves? Are they just the worst of us? Or are they us? Is this the only way it can ever turn out? Are we incapable of anything but this? Is an independent spirit impossible to uncouple from the failings that birth that spirit? Are we just too fucked up? If we do find the answer, there's no telling when, or how slowly, or how suddenly it might unfold. History's long, it requires patience, but there are things, perhaps even great things, awaiting us that neither you nor I have any way of seeing from the cheap seats of the present. Nobody saw them coming. They arrived overnight. And if you squint hard enough, and you look past their failings for just long enough, you see people driven forward by their convictions, by a sincerely felt mandate to make this place better. Before anyone could make sense of what was unfolding, they won far more than anyone had thought possible. They will not be the last.